Whirlwinds of danger are raging around us. Overwhelming forces of darkness prevail. Still in the fight, see advancing before us. Bright flag of liberty that yet shall prevail.
Hello, folks. Today we are going to be talking about the fundamentals of Marxist-Leninism by Otto Kusin, published by the Soviet Union in 1960. Marxist-Leninism is, of course, one of the most scientific, successful communist and socialist ideologies to ever be birthed by humankind. It has liberated millions from being peasant toilers. It has taken peasant agricultural societies to spacefaring nations in the Soviet Union. It's taken the People's Republic of China from an agricultural society to a world behemoth. And in addition to that, it remains one of the most succinct ideologies in terms of explaining both the issues with capitalism and how to overthrow it and how to build socialism and build towards that communism. There are some issues with this book. It's, first of all, very, very boring. I do not recommend reading The Fundamentals of Marxist-Leninism. It is over 600 pages with a lot of fluff. And in addition to that, it was written during the Khrushchev era. And so there is a lot of Khrushchevite revisionism within this book. And I have attempted to take all of that out. However, there's a lot of good lessons. There's a lot of fundamental ideas in here. And I hope that this episode can be a really good introduction for people who are getting into Marxist-Leninist theory, for people who are curious about it, and for even comrades who are well-versed in it. I hope that this can give you something new, or at least reaffirm your fundamentals. So let's dive right into it. The basis of Marxist-Leninism is dialectical and historical materialism. All throughout history, the ruling classes have tried to push ignorance and superstition through idealism onto the rest of the population. And they have struggled against materialism, which is the foundational philosophy of the proletariat, of the working class, and of Marxist-Leninism. But what is materialism and what is idealism? One of the biggest questions that have divided philosophical schools for hundreds of years is, what is the basis of reality? The human mind or the world outside of it? You know, the sun, the trees, space, water, air. Materialism says that the world outside of our mind is the basis of reality. Idealism says that the human mind and its subjectivities are the basis of reality, right? So that is really the big fundamental point that separates idealistic ideologies, which believe that the human mind and its thoughts and all the limitations of the human mind, the subjectivities of the human mind are the basis of reality, and materialism, which says actually the sun, trees, human economies, right, which are, yes, made up of individuals, but have their own laws, and human societies, which, yes, are made up of individuals, but also operate on their own laws, are the basis of reality, and the human mind is simply just a reflection of that reality outside of it. For idealism, you can think of Rene Descartes' line, "I think, therefore I am," right? That was such an idealist notion. Basically, Rene Descartes there was saying, I only know that reality is real because I'm able to think. It's based on the individual's mind outward. Materialists say, no, the world exists around me, then I do. If I put baking soda and vinegar in a baking soda volcano, and let's say my friend Ali in Yemen, halfway across the world, does the same, the baking soda and vinegar are going to have the same reaction. We're both going to observe it at the same time, and that's how we know that the world exists outside of the human mind, whether we like it or not. Those who use materialism see the world for what it really is. Think of fascism. It's such an idealistic ideology that presupposes human beings are marked by some great force known as race, and therefore are predestined to be inferior or superior, to act this way or that way, since the beginning and forever. Materialism says no, man acts as according to the world around him. Race, as we understand it today, is constructed because of the economic motivations of the expanding European powers who needed slaves to fuel their new infant emerging system called capitalism. A poor man that does crimes does it not because of his skin color, but because of the social conditions around him, because of the deprivation, the artificial deprivation enforced onto him by capitalist and class society. That is the difference between materialism, communism, and fascism, that a very idealist ideology. Even though it presents itself as scientific, it's very idealist. It's very based in this idealist notion, almost a religious notion of race. and pseudoscience, a lot of pseudoscience. As Otto says, quote, philosophical idealism refuses to recognize the reality of external material world, repudiating it and proclaiming it unreal, and advancing instead an imagined non-material world. While materialism as an ideology existed before Marx and Engels, they were the first to apply it to human societies and thusly developed dialectical and historical materialism, which are the two tools of materialism and Marxism. While liberal thinkers, being idealists, contend that capitalism has always existed, historical materialism and dialectics say that capitalism is a temporary stage within humanity, that humanity went through several different economies, and there is nothing permanent about any single economy of human society. That human society, just like the universe, is always in a flux of change, right? So that is the foundation of dialectics. Dialectics is the idea that nothing in the universe is permanent, that everything in the universe is in constant motion. You know, the biggest mountain over thousands of years will wither to dust and transform into something new. In the same way, human societies and their economies are not permanent. Either we went from these more communal hunter-gatherer societies, which were fairly equal. Marx and Engels, in fact, dubbed the earliest human societies primitive communists because they didn't have any classes. Everything was done for the tribe. This is before farming also. This is like very, very early human societies before they even discovered farming. And then human society went to slavery, a slave-based economy and civilization. And with that came class society. And then we transformed into feudalism, which saw the dividing of land and peasants working on it and paying taxes in the form of food. And then we transitioned into capitalism, which was based on private ownership of the means of production and concentration of the means of production into the hands of the bourgeois. And capitalism, too, will eventually change. Capitalism, too, will eventually transform into a new system, and that system is socialism and communism, right? Just like a stream one day becomes the Grand Canyon, capitalism is not permanent, right? The Grand Canyon wasn't always there, and it will not always be there, right? In the same way, capitalism was not always there, and it will not always be there, and that is dialectic. Idealism and capitalist philosophy says that capitalism has always been here since human society was first formed. And they'll point towards, like, oh, look at trade. We had trade before, and they'll call that capitalism. That's not capitalism. The capitalism is very specific to our economic mode of production, which is the private ownership of the means of production, right? So this is the difference between idealism and dialectics and materialism. The goal of idealism, which is a philosophy pushed by the ruling classes, the bourgeois specifically, is to deviate the proletariat from seeking the real truth. Think of how the Democrats and Republicans are always trying to get us to be angry at these stupid culture wars that mean fundamentally nothing. These are very idealist notions that they push onto us. Oh, we have to stop the Republicans, the big bad Republicans, or oh, we have to stop the woke culture. Really, they're trying to push onto us an idealist form of analysis of society over a materialist one, which is what would really help free the working class. The battle for communism through communist parties itself, you should think of as a battle for the proletariat against idealism, the idealism of the bourgeois, whose answers for the issues of the world are more and more unsatisfactory to the crises of capitalism themselves. Every time we have a new crisis of capitalism, it's always minority this, LGBTQ that, woke culture this, or big bad Republicans that. But more and more, the issues, the true materialist basis of society, which is class struggle, which is that capitalism itself is broken, becomes makes these bad explanations glaring and unexplainable without the scientific truths of class struggle and revolution. And the materialist outlook represented by communist parties, as Marx put it, terrorizes the bourgeois as, quote, because it includes in its comprehension and affirmative recognition of the existing state of things, at the same time also the recognition of the negation of that state, of its inevitable breaking up, because it regards every historically developed social form as in fluid motion, and therefore takes into account its transient nature not less than its momentary existence, because it lets nothing impose upon it, and it, in its essence, critical and revolutionary. End quote. So basically, Marx there is just saying, like, communism recognizes that capitalism is not permanent, and that really scares the bourgeois to their core. It recognizes that capitalism has very inherent contradictions. Marxist dialectics is also heavily based in the idea of cause and effect, It believes that no actions happen in a vacuum, and in order to find their origins, one must study all conditions that allowed it to happen. For example, World War I, while initiated by the killing of Archduke Ferdinand by Princeps, was really rooted in and caused by the turmoils of the imperialist stage of capitalism, which inevitably leads to inter-imperialist wars. These so-called world wars are the effect of the inevitable conditions of capitalism. And so, while materialists recognize that World War I was rooted in the contradictions of capitalism itself, idealists say, oh, it was just because Princeps shot Archduke Ferdinand. Dialectics, also being rooted in science, roots out all socialist ideologies that do not work, that are unscientific. As with time, practice, observation, theories such as ultra-left ones, which, quote, ignore the natural development of events and underestimate the importance of everyday work among the masses, of preparing them for revolution, of building up the revolutionary forces, and, quote, end up failing and fall to the wayside. Scientific socialism is also based in the conception of a great leap, in which everyday operations of a system cause it to have a fundamental shift to a new one. There are leaps within the scientific world, for example, the laws of physics, which eventually cause stars to leap from big balls of gas into huge explosions as the stars eat up the cores, and they cause these big, huge explosions called supernovas. In the same way, human societies have these big leaps as these systems of economics start eating themselves up and explode into revolution. So that is a leap. You can sort of think of Mao's Great Leap Forward, which was also a big, huge explosion of a new economic productive society. You know, they tried to industrialize a very rural agricultural society. And these leaps only happen when the operations and internal contradictions and logic of a socio-political system eventually eat themselves and explosively cause a jump to a new one. And we call that leap a revolution. Marxist contradictions are ultimately based on the struggle of opposites. And this struggle between two opposing things moves systems forward. The struggle of opposites, the contradiction, is the engine of human society. So while, for example, mathematics, the struggle of opposites is like addition and subtraction, in human societies, these contradictions are usually the class struggle, as the ruling class sits on the opposite end of the socio-political ladder of the ruled class. So there's a class in power, there's a class without power. And this struggle of opposites moves history forward. This is the engine that moves history forward. Their struggle for power, for resources, etc., make up history. And the resolving of these contradictions caused the development of history itself. Alongside primary contradictions within human society, like class struggle, there's also a myriad of secondary contradictions that stem off of this primary one. Contradictions between colonized and colonizers, such as what we're seeing in Israel and Palestine right now. The root of all of these contradictions are, of course, the primary contradiction of class struggle, like under capitalism, but it does lead to racial, colonizer, and colonized secondary contradiction. Contradictions allow us to see that the capitalist class struggle between the capitalist and the proletariat will always remain under capitalist society until it is overthrown by revolution. But just because old contradictions are gotten rid of by revolution doesn't mean that contradictions disappear entirely. There will always be contradictions within socialist society. The contradictions that typically haunt them are rapid progress of a socialist society, which means the growth of material and cultural requirements of people. But also, while the socialist society is trying to progress so quickly to a new economic mode of production and also a new cultural mode of production, there's a contradiction that's created between that progressive force and old ideas and forces that hold people back from a new socialist future. There's also a contradiction between advanced and backwards aspects of society, such as the Soviet Union, which went from like a semi-feudal society mostly made up of peasants to this very advanced economic system of socialism. And as Marxism typically orthodoxically envisioned itself, it was supposed to happen in the most highly developed capitalist economy. So this contradiction between peasants and this very highly developed jump to socialism had to be resolved. And that a contradiction of opposites don't always have to resolve themselves violently. They can be resolved peacefully. Of course, there are some class contradictions, such as the contradiction between the proletariat and the bourgeois, that has to be resolved violently. But the contradiction between the peasants and the working class, that could be resolved through peaceful cooperation and mutual growth of each other. The contradictions that arise in socialist society are usually resolved through the party, apparatus, the state, and the work of the masses working together. Until, this class contradictions are completely gotten rid of, there are no more classes and the state can eventually wither away. Contradiction and the struggle of opposites always includes the new, which replaces the old. And so this is a very important conception. The new always will replace the old. As contradictions in an old system heighten, the system collapses and is replaced by a new one. But that new system always has contradictions itself, even if they are very hard to sparse out in its early stages. So, for example, capitalism looked completely like a different beast than the one we're dealing with now. For early economists like Adam Smith, when the new economy of capitalism replaced the old economy of feudalism, as the contradictions of feudalism led it to wither away and explode into revolution. The new economy of capitalism looked very, very progressive for thinkers like Adam Smith, but as capitalism developed slowly but surely, those seeds of contradictions heightened and allowed Marx to analyze it easier and see trends within capitalism that he was never able to see before. And those contradictions furthered as capitalism developed into the imperialist stage, which allowed Lenin to see contradictions that Marx had never seen. Therefore, contradictions are there in every single system, even socialism, even eventually when we get to it, full communism. But during the beginning of a system, it's very hard to see. As a system develops further and further, it becomes more advanced, sets itself in, grows more. That's when contradictions become easier and easier to sparse out. However, just because a new system is created from an old system, that doesn't mean it's a complete, clean and complete break from the old system. As many left comms and anarchists tend to believe, as, quote, when the socialist social system is built upon the ruins of capitalist society, the quote-unquote negation of capitalism does not imply the complete destruction of everything created by mankind under capitalism. The productive forces and valuable achievements of science and culture are preserved and continue to develop. As far from being destroyed by the proletarian revolution, everything of value that was created by capitalism serves as a basis for further progress for the building of socialism. Speaking against people who denied the importance for socialism of old culture created under the bourgeois system, Lenin said that, quote, the socialist culture is not something that has sprung out of nowhere, that nobody knows whence, and that it must be a result of a natural development of the stores of knowledge which humankind has accumulated under the yoke of capitalist society. So therefore, socialist society is birthed by the mark of its old society, that is capitalism. It carries a lot of its contradictions, it carries a lot of its ugly aspects, but it must resolve these contradictions. It must hold on to the progressive elements of capitalism, which is the building up of productive forces, which is the getting rid of peasant class relations, which is some progressive ideas to our culture. There are some liberal ideas of the equality of mankind. Of course, liberalism doesn't practice that fully, but it claims to be for the equality of all mankind. These are progressive ideas that can be held on to. But the regressive ideas of capitalism, such as, this very cutthroat dog-eat-dog world, this very cutthroat racialized ideas, they must be gotten rid of, thrown away with the transition to socialism. But they will be held on to. And that is a contradiction that must be struggled against when a revolution happens. Some people will always hold on to new ideas whenever a revolution happens. The full communism that we are seeking ultimately is itself a spiral, right? So this full communism, Marx and Engels looked back at the earliest human societies, which were primitive communist societies that had no classes, that were communal, in which the tribe worked for everybody else. And they're trying to bring back these class relations to the productive forces of capitalism, to this highly industrial developed system that we have now. And so this is how history is a spiral. This is how you think dialectically. We're bringing back that old class relation of primitive communism of our hunter-gatherer ancestors and imbuing it within the modern day world with our modern day newfangled big machinery. Happens nothing magically. A revolution doesn't magically get rid of all old ideas. With the dialectics, it's important not to fall into a linear path of thinking, of presupposing that humanity always develops in a straight line. Lenin, of course, himself described the development of humanity as more of a spiral, which holds some elements of the past and brings in new ones at every stage. Dialectics is ultimately a scientific study of human systems and finding repeatable trends within them that allows for revolutionary change of reality. Parties and ideologies that abandon materialist dialectics are ultimately all doomed to fail. And as they fall into the same mistakes over and over again of past labor and socialist movements, the parties that do hold on to dialectics and dialectical materialism always succeed. And this knowledge of dialectics has been gained through practice. Something that idealist, socialist, and left communist varieties always fail to grasp is that practice of an idea is just as important part of an equation of materialist dialectics as the theory itself. Just like the scientific method, you have to do an experiment with your hypothesis, and the results of this experiment often end up opening up more avenues for further exploring of the world and developing your theories. And through practice, your theories can come to change the world, which then means that you need to reflect on what worked, what didn't work, and further develop your theory with a new world situation that you've created through changing the world itself. This is the dialectical process between theory and the material world around it. Now, it's important to avoid two errors that communists fall into, and that is either the crude reliance on only practice without theory. This is called pragmatism, and this is something that MAGA communists often fall into. They'll often say, you need to be more pragmatic. Stop, quoting Lenin and proving that I'm wrong in my chauvinistic ideas that American patriotism is not contradictory to communism. And the people who fall into only theory with no practice, left comms, Bordigas fall into this. Both are erroneous errors that are always doomed to fail. As with idealistic socialists, they often fall into the trap of, quote, ignoring reality, of groundless fantasy, and of processing of thought being converted into something self-contained, into an end in itself. The reliable antidote to this link with practice, with life, with production, and with experience of people. Genuine science advances because it is always returned to sense experience, to practice, end quote. Ultimately, all theory is our best attempts at describing the world around us and getting as close as we can to it. And all human beings are limited in this. We cannot know every single facet and operation of whole economies, not Lenin, not Marx. Of course, they did do very good jobs of just scientifically explaining them as best as they can, but Lenin and Marx didn't know every single trade that was going on, every single facet of the capitalist economy, every single way the capitalist economy was manifesting itself within like Latvia or in the furthest reaches of the planet. Governments, social relations, operations, and ideologies are all our best attempts at describing these, and all we can do is to get as close to the quote-unquote truth as possible. And through practice and observation, we hone our theories every single time to get closer and closer to the truth. That is the scientific process of Marxist-Leninism. And that's what Marxist-Leninism has managed to accomplish. If you read the works of Marx, Lenin, Engels, Stalin, Mao, Ho Chi Minh, etc., they are all very, very surprisingly relevant to our modern day world, even though they were written 100 years ago, 150 years ago. And you very quickly realize that a lot of their works, like Lenin's works, could have been written yesterday, especially as we, right now, as I'm recording this, are on the eve of a possible World War III and world conflict. And that's because all these thinkers, they observed repeatable trends about capitalism and socialism around them, and they described them. And so humanity, as long as it is under the same material conditions, as long as it is under the same capitalist economy, is always doomed to repeat these trends that Lenin, that Stalin, that Marx, that Engels observed. The truth is only found through theory and practice in a constant dance between them both. A common error is of, quote, dogmatism, which views theoretical propositions as absolute universal truth that can be applied equally in all cases, regardless of the concrete situation and emergence of new phenomena, end quote. So, really right now you can see this in, this is a really erroneous error in Bordigism. Bordigists right now look at the Palestinian struggle for liberation and they say, the Palestinian struggle for liberation is bad because these are ultimately a nationalist chauvinist group. They should be fighting for the proletarian class struggle along with the Israelis. Well, the Israeli class struggle is very complicated. The Israelis are a labor aristocracy. They're a settler colonialist population. And the Palestinians are a colonized people who are being settler colonized and replaced. The class struggle that they are trying to apply, this very hardline Marxist class struggle, is ridiculous. It's almost pro-genocidal in the Palestinian liberation case, in which Bordigists are always crying that Israelis are dying because these are so-called proletarians, and they're always crying that Palestinian liberation is quote-unquote jihadist because they're working with national Palestinian liberation fighters. They're dogmatists. They view their theoretical proposition as a universal truth that can be applied equally in all cases, even in the case of settler colonialism. And so this is a very common error that a lot of Marxists fall into. And so you have to look at Marxism and Marxist-Leninism as a tool. You have to very carefully study how it can be applied the most effectively. And of course, it can be changed to material circumstances as they change in other places. And a settler colonial context is very different than a European context of class struggle. And of course, the settler colonial liberation context of Palestine is a class struggle in of itself. It's just a class struggle that manifests itself through Israeli settlerism and a resistance to that settlerism. And so that is a very common error. On the other hand, quote, revisionism, you can think of MAG communists. On the other hand, as far as mythology is concerned, adopts extreme relativism and attributes no more relative character to every truth, disowning the fundamental principles of Marxism which constitute its revolutionary essence. And so revisionists MAG communists do the exact opposite. They say, oh, nothing about Marxism is true. Our circumstances are so different that none of Marx's sayings are true and don't apply to this case. You can think of, for example, how MAGA communists said that Marx didn't believe in the abolition of private property, or that doesn't work within the American context. No, absolutely. That wasn't universal truth of Marxism. And so you have to get really good at finding out the parts of ideology that are universal and parts of ideology that change due to material circumstances. And if you don't, you either fall into this very dogmatist, pro-genocidal line of the Bordigas, who are basically looking at Holocaust camp victims and saying, why don't they work with the German proletariat? Or you can fall into this MAGA communist idea of Marx didn't believe in the abolition of private property. In fact, one of the greatest contributions to materialism that Marx and Engels made was that practice is the only way for you to figure out if your theories are right. Practice is the criterion of truth. Pragmatism, which Marxist MAGA communists fall into, only end up believing that action divorced from theory is the basis for liberation, right? So very often you talk to MAGA communists, everything is about pragmatism. This, however, easily lends itself to fascism, as, quote, by subordinating all practical and theoretical activities to the considerations of immediate advantage, pragmatism furthers the development of a subjective, narrowly utilitarian, opportunist approach to life. Applied to the working class movement, it means advocating the policy of petty affairs and the fighting for a farthing. It means a loss of perspective and betrayal of class interests of the proletariat, end quote. Essentially, action must be guided by theory, and theory by lessons learned from action, and not on crude practice. Since the beginning of time, many philosophers have sought to see what moves history. Marx and Engels' greatest contribution was the realization that historical materialism, as a tool of observing history, was that class struggle moves history through their tool of historical materialism. Historical materialism is the other tool of Marxism and materialism. Historical materialism looks at history scientifically to find repeatable trends and analyze the world as it comes today. For example, Marx and Engels, when they looked at historical materialism, they did so based on objective material conditions that they had inherited around them. So when they were looking at capitalism and examining it, they were studying history, first of all, and looking at the conditions that it had created. For example, when we're looking at the Jacobins of the French Revolution, we can see how they moved history out of feudalism to capitalism, but only because they lived under feudalism, and that feudalism that was dying and it was in its very last breaths. The conditions that the Jacobins were living in that late stage feudalism allowed the Jacobins to strike and progress humanity to a new system. So what is the basis of historical materialism? The basis of all societies, as historical materialism sees it, is the mode of production. And the mode of production, most simply, is just how society produces its most basic needs. Food, shelter, clothing. Everybody within every single society needs either a roof over their head, clothes on their back, food in their belly, and shelter. And there are some cultures that don't need shelter, some cultures that don't need clothes. But for the most part, almost all cultures on Earth need these things. There's a couple hunter-gatherer tribes out there that don't use clothes or don't use houses or some kind of structure, but most do. And so these things, these material needs are often shaped by geographical environment, population size, technological advancement, and the relation in how these get produced. So, for example, the basis of the economy in feudalism was the noble renting out land, which was land being divided, peasants work on it, peasants pay taxes in the form of crops, or slave labor, that was ancient Rome, or private individuals owning the means of production. These are the relations in how these things get produced, these very basic things that we need. It's the relation between me and my other human beings in how I get my food, how I get my shelter, and how I get my clothes, right? That can be a slave-based economy, that can be a feudal-based economy, that can be a capitalist-based economy, or that can be a socialist-based economy. These are all different modes of production. And it's important to realize that a lot of these relations are determined by technology. It would have been almost nearly impossible for capitalists to own the means of production before the Industrial Revolution, when the labor output was very small. Only with the conquering of Americas, the slave trade, and the Industrial Revolution that came as a result of all the capital and surplus labor value gained from that, could European capitalists have enough labor power to create capitalism and the relations around it. One of the biggest contradictions that arises between economies is relations and the productive forces themselves, right? So the productive forces are the technological advancement of a society, right? So, and productive relations are your relations to that advancement, that technology in society and other people in society. For example, in the final days of feudalism, the old relationship between peasants and noblemen was slowing down and burst into that new capitalist era. And currently in our capitalist mode of production, it is being severely hindered. Our technological advancements are being severely hindered by private ownership of the means of production by these big monopolies. We could absolutely live in a post-scarcity world, right? There's this big contradiction right now under capitalism in which we have gotten to a point where we produce more than enough goods for everybody to live within a post-scarcity world, for everybody to live a good quality of life. But we have artificial scarcity because of the relations of production. Our productive forces are good enough to give everybody housing, right, within America, everybody within America, food on their table. We produce more than enough food to feed everybody on Earth. But because of the relations of production, because a private individual has to own everything and has to do everything for exchange rates, for profit, we have artificial scarcity. So there's a big contradiction between the technological level of advancement we've gotten and how it's used, right? And it's in some ways even hindering our ability to advance scientifically, having big monopolies own all of these big, massive things, and to develop humanity productively. Like, think of AI. AI is currently being used to take people out of jobs, put people out onto the street, when this amazing new technology could be used to instead improve our lives, to make us work less hours at work, to have more leisure time, while these machines do a lot of the work for us, right? But instead it's being used by Silicon Valley tech bros to threaten to put us out of a job and to make us work harder. That right there is a classic example of the contradiction between the productive forces, which is this amazing AI technology that could help everybody, and the relations of production. It's in the hands of the Silicon Valley tech bro billionaires that want to use it to threaten us to work more hours for less pay, because if you bastards do not work hard, I will throw you out onto the streets and replace you all with AI and automation. In addition to that, historical materialism also recognizes that there are two structures within every single society: the base and the superstructure. The base is the means of production and the relations around them: capitalism, feudalism, slavery. This is all the biggest basis of society. This is the root of all society. On top of the base of society sits the superstructure: the laws, culture, media, news, governments, education. Basically, everything within society is connected to its mode of production and reinforces it. Our schools, our educational systems reinforce capitalist thinking within our children. That is the superstructure. Our laws protect capitalists and their interests as much as possible. The basis of society is that relation of production, that capitalist mode of production. But the superstructure, government laws, these are all made to protect that capitalist relation of production as much as possible. Our movies make capitalists always the good guys, like the Americans and the Soviets, the Chinese, the Venezuelans, bad guys. It protects imperialism. So that is a relationship between the base and the superstructure. And the superstructure protects it, and it's a cyclical loop. So if the mode of production in a society is feudalism, the laws are about peasants not having rights. The government looks like kings and castles. If the mode of production is capitalism, the news that you see in the New York Times is about how great American capitalism and Jeff Bezos are. The laws passed by your city council are to cut tax rates for the big business baron and to make it easier for outside investors, etc., etc. The basis of our culture in our society and our government is capitalism, and it all serves to reinforce capitalism within our minds. Ultimately, this is why Marx said that the, quote, the ideas of the ruling class in every society and every epoch are the ruling ideas, end quote. Because the structure within capitalist society is meant to protect the interests of capitalism and to reinforce them within us. You know, from our children's education to the halls of Congress to even the music that we listen to. Think of a rapper bragging about how rich he is. What do you think that reinforces within his listeners? It reinforces a love for capitalism, right? And people do this consciously. People do this unconsciously. I don't think most rappers rapping and bragging about their gold chains and their McMansions really are realizing that they're reinforcing capitalism within a superstructure. But sometimes it is done consciously. Perhaps like the defense industry is very heavily involved within Hollywood and movie making. In order to lend out special things like military equipment, movies have to be very pro-American. Regardless of whether it's done intentionally or not, it all reproduces capitalism within our minds. And that is why a radical revolution and not reformism is so important. If we only change the superstructure, we put a Band-Aid on the base of society. Social democrats and Demsocs like Bernie Sanders, all they do is inevitably put a Band-Aid on society with some reform, some welfare in the superstructure, in the government. But the oppressive structures of capitalism within the base remain and reproduce themselves. So essentially what capitalism does when you try to do capitalism with a kinder face is eventually erode whatever welfare protections, whatever Band-Aid was put on top of it. The only lasting change to completely change society, to revolutionarily change our mode of production, to revolutionary actually create a long permanent change, is to smash the base, is to smash the relation of productions and to create a new relation of production, socialism. The way that the base and superstructure is set up in capitalist society always leads workers to fall into the most pro-capitalist parties, ideologies, and ideas. In fact, it's inescapable, and I'm sure we all have our liberal guilty pleasures. You know, we all have that one movie or video game or something that's very pro-liberal. My girlfriend, who is a communist, she loves Harry Potter. She admits that she shouldn't. But there will always be a section of the working class that's more conscious than others. And this section of the working class will use these superstructures like government and politics to advocate for the working class and use institutions allowed in the superstructure like political participation to form trade unions, to do political agitation, to spread consciousness, like this podcast maybe, and to guide the rest of the working class in a vanguard party. So within the superstructure, within liberal capitalist society, we have a little bit of space to organize, especially those of us that are the section of the working class that are more class conscious than others. Within every single society, there's a section of the working class, maybe the majority of the working class, that is endowed within that capitalist hegemony, within that superstructure, within that capitalist ideology, you know, Democrat or Republican. And there's a little section of the working class that is more advanced than others. And we have the ability within capitalist society to advocate for the working class, to form trade unions, to do political agitation, to guide the rest of the working class in a vanguard party. Now, we've talked a lot about capitalism, but what is capitalism exactly and how did it arise? Humanity has gone through several phases of development. The one we're going to concern ourselves with the most is feudalism, because that's the one that capitalism was birthed out of. But first of all, I will give you the first development of human society was the earliest human societies, which were these primitive, communist, hunter-gatherer societies. People lived for the tribe. Everything was done communally for the tribe. There were no classes within the tribe whatsoever. It was an egalitarian society where everybody worked for each other. And it was a society based on this radical equality. Then, when humans began to produce a little bit, it led to slowly but surely the creation of class society and civilization as we know it. Now let's move on to feudalism. After the fall of slave societies of antiquity like Rome, the world entered into feudalism. Though feudalism is an all-encompassing term that involves a lot of different societies, what feudalism meant in England was a very different thing than what it meant in Iran. At its basis, feudalism would see lords divide up the land and have peasants work on it for them, with peasants paying taxes for working on the land. It was in some ways better than slavery, as peasants had a much better incentive to produce things. Slaves were often worked to death. They didn't own the land that they were on. And in feudalism, peasants, they got a little plot of land for themselves. They just had to pay taxes for the lord. However, the regressive thing about feudalism was that the peasants were completely dependent on the whims of their lords, and their lords could be assholes. While feudal society was mostly rural, there were also big urban centers and towns within feudal society. And in these big urban centers and town was where capitalism was born. As the merchant classes of feudalism, these towns during the age of feudalism began trading and expanding themselves internationally, coming to encompass great fortunes and transform themselves in the process of becoming the earliest sections of the bourgeoisie, the capitalist classes. However, for these early upcoming bourgeoisie, which had traded with the whole world, this merchant class, they had a problem, and that was that they were not the rulers of society. The rulers of society were the feudal, noble, and kings. And so the coming bourgeois society also needed to free the workers, to have them not bound to feudal land so that they could exploit their labor. They needed national markets not controlled by kings and nobles. And so this would begin the era of liberal revolutions, like the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and the era of capitalism as we know it. Whereas before, peasants under feudalism had common ownership of the land, and therefore the main means of production of the economy was somewhat shared communally. Under capitalism, that was deprived from the vast majority of humanity. The vast majority of humanity no longer had a sense of property, and it was put into the hands of the new ruling class, the bourgeois, and the capitalists. The rest of humanity with no ownership whatsoever would be forced to sell their labor power to the capitalists in exchange for wages. This section of humanity became known as the proletariat, or the working class. And through colonialism, this system became global and led to one of the biggest division in labor ever seen before in human history. As not only would labor be divided into hierarchies within a home country, bourgeois and proletariat in England, but along entire country lines, as there would become exploiter nations like Britain and exploited nations like Britain's colonies. The capitalist system carries within it many contradictions. These big industrial behemoths of the Industrial Revolution are used to produce more than enough commodities, and yet we, as the workers, live within artificial scarcity because they're owned by the capitalists. The class struggle has heightened to never-before-seen tensions, as the working class is deprived of the basic goods of life, and finally, this is leading all of us to rally politically to change not the relations of production, but not the means of production, but the relations of production. The masses must own the industrial behemoths. The 99% must own the means of production, and not the 1% if humanity is to survive, as the bourgeois lead us towards extinction. Historical materialism does not mean that anything is inevitable. And many people often follow to this idea that capitalism will follow to its own without any organization. However, quote, historical laws themselves without people do not make history. They determine the course of history only through actions, the struggle and consciously directed effort of millions of people. That is all to say that the historical rules that Marxism observes do not exist outside of people, but because of them and their actions. While the fall of capitalism may be inevitable because of the inherent contradictions of the system, its fall actually depends on the actions of the working class, including communist parties, organizations, class consciousness, and the ability of communist parties to effectively mobilize the masses. As Che Guevara would very famously say, quote, "The revolution is not an apple that falls when ripe. You have to make the apple fall," end quote. So in doing so, materialism does not actually think of ideology as useless. In fact, the goal of Marxists is to give the working class consciousness, the working class a class-conscious ideology. Materialism just recognizes that ideological roots are in the economic basis society, but this does not mean that ideology does not shape society. That is because ideas and ideologies that ring within material conditions, the ideologies that describe the material conditions the best and describe the material conditions of the masses the best, become mass ideas that then become action, and through action and consciousness transform the material world itself. And that is the goal of all Marxists, to actually take our ideology into action and actually change the world itself. Not just be a philosophical exercise, as so many academic Marxists always want to do. There's a big class of academic Marxists that simply want to use Marx as an intellectual exercise. No. The goal of Marxism is to actually fundamentally change the world for the better. The ideology of the masses always is incoherent. The ideology of the masses that are not class conscious, as there's always, quote, a revolutionary phenomena and tendency, as well as old reactionary ideas present within the masses. As some workers and sections of the populations are always more advanced and class conscious than others, especially in old decaying systems. And while some sections of the working class remain attached to old dying ideas, quote, the progressive ideology possesses a decisive advantage in that it reflects the demands of social development. Revolutionary ideas can be forbidden, but they cannot be destroyed. Sooner or later, they take possession of the masses, spur them to action, and then the end of the old system. Thus, social ideas are interwoven in the natural course of historical development, end quote. Because the means of production and the way that history is moved under capitalism is held in such a tiny minority of the population, the vast majority of the population, because it has no direct control, ends up holding mystical views, right? So since I, as a worker, don't really control the media, don't really control factories, don't really have any say in society because, I'm allowed to vote in very controlled elections, because remember, the base of society, the economic motivations of society determine all elections, and that is capitalism. And so elections which exist in the superstructure don't actually end up meaning anything. They reflect the capitalist relations. A lot of workers end up holding mystical and idealistic views of society. These idealistic views can be liberalism, fascism, what have you, anarcho-capitalist primitivism, whatever, like these made-up ideologies. But sections of the working class always gain class consciousness, always become aware of their historical role, and always, during moments of capitalist crises like World War I, the working class becomes revolutionary and materialistic and overcomes that mysticism that's given to it by the capitalist relation of production. The working class is one of the most unique classes in history, as its role is not only revolution, like the last revolutionary classes such as the bourgeois, the capitalists under feudalism, but also a revolution to free itself and all other classes, not to become new oppressors like the bourgeois did after the liberal revolutions, but to free the peasants, to free the vast majority of humanity, and to end classes themselves under communism. Capitalism has created an economy in which the main power is concentrated in a class that has all the tools to free itself, right? From education to the allowance of space for the ability of workers to organize politically, capitalism, even when it's trying to repress workers and the working class, have opened up a Pandora's box because we have all these opportunities to politically organize ourselves in ways that peasants never did. We have ways to educate ourselves, to ways to organize that were really not available under other modes of production, under past modes of production like slave modes of production. The working class is unique. Capitalism is unique, and it allows us a great opportunity to build socialism, to overturn this system in a way that humanity was not really able to do before. Of course, what happens from place to place is not always 100% the same, but there are very universal laws that Marxist-Leninism discovered, such as how Lenin, in the midst of World War I, was able to accurately predict that with capitalism having reached an imperialist stage of production and divided the world into markets, that world wars were just a normal condition of the system. And Lenin has been proven right by World War II and the current global crisis that we are seeing after his death, which is World War III. So Lenin was able to predict World War II, World War III by using historical materialism, by using Marxism. Liberalism does not recognize any universal laws. In fact, even as early as the 1960s, when Otto was writing The Fundamentals of Marxist-Leninism, liberal philosophers were envisioning an end to history, that capitalism was all humanity had ever achieved, that all humanity ever will achieve. A theory that capitalism was the economy that humanity has always had. And this has been expanded after the collapse of the USSR by Fukuyama, Professor Fukuyama, in his book, The End of History, and has become sort of the guiding ideology of our neoliberal age, that there are no universal laws, that capitalism is all humanity will achieve, that there is no such thing as, for example, as Tony Blair in 1999 would declare, Tony Blair, the leader of the UK Labour Party, the class war is over. This is really what sets Marxist-Leninism and liberalism apart. Marxist-Leninists see human society as always evolving, moving, and operating with predictable laws. Liberals, see human society as static, seeing it as capitalist, and things like war, revolution, strikes, and economic crashes come out of nowhere. Liberals cannot explain why these things happen. To them, it just happens for no reason other than personal feelings. It's almost a religious attachment to these ideas. One of Marx's greatest discoveries was that of class struggle, and that class struggle was the guiding motivation for history. Whereas before, philosophers had come up with ideas of the divine right of kings, these religious ideas for why humanity evolves, Marx realized this singular thread that was guiding the engine of human society and its advancement that no one else had seen before. Class division began in the earliest human societies when, due to technological advancements, humans were able to create surpluses. So whereas before everybody was working for subsistence, suddenly people were able to have a little bit more than other people, which required the division of labor itself, right? When you're producing more than enough food to feed more than you, and you're able to trade, somebody else can get fed by other people and work on metal smithing, or as in our current society, a clown, right? Like nobody has to subsist for themselves anymore. We get fed by farmers in faraway lands, and we're able to work as yoga teachers that do healing chakra crystals, all these division of labor jobs. But this division of labor also, in effect, led to exploited classes and exploiting classes. What makes our current mode of production so great is that we currently exist in a society and in technical age of advancement in which we produce more than enough. Surplus for all of humanity. More than enough food, housing, basic goods for all of humanity. And so the only thing that's holding us back from abolishing classes under the current capitalist mode of production, which is what makes socialism and communism inevitable, is the class relation. We are no longer limited by technology as people in feudalism were to feed everybody. People in feudalism still had issues with feeding everybody. In terms of taking care of all human beings, we produce more than enough to feed, house everybody. The only thing that's holding us back is that relation of production between the bourgeois and the proletariat, between me and the capitalist, my boss. And eventually, the workers will realize this, that we don't need the capitalists, and in fact, they are a hindrance to our lives. Class conflict is the main driving force of history because, quote, the incompatibility of economic desires between antagonistic classes, which then gives rise to an implacable struggle between them, freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight. A fight that each time ended either in revolutionary reconstitution of society at large or in the common ruin of the contending classes." End quote. So class struggle is an engine that drives history because the ruling classes and the ruled always fight over resources, always fight over power. Within capitalist society, the two main classes that are in contention are, of course, the capitalists, the bourgeois, and the proletariat, the working class. The bourgeois had once a long time ago, been a progressive force for history. It freed humanity from feudalism. However, it's quickly become a new oppressor as the system of capitalism has developed. The other class, the proletariat, is the main creator of wealth for the bourgeois. As capitalism and the vast hoards of wealth that it has developed from the exploitation of the proletariat has led to the proletariat using the tools of capitalism to use mass communication, education, and political participation to fight the bourgeois. And this really is showing how the tools of capitalism create its own gravediggers. That capitalism, by creating this educated, politically motivated workforce, even if it is hindered by mystical beliefs, even if it is hindered by liberalism, will eventually realize its own economic class interests and overthrow them. Capitalism itself never had a complete and clean break from feudalism. We've retained some feudal aspects, like the landlords. Landlords are a very feudal concept and a feudal structure, and within many societies have still remained, quickly becoming the new bourgeois. The peasantry under capitalism has still existed in some places, like Russia on the eve of the revolution. In some societies, like Asian societies, there's still some peasants that are living very feudal rural lives within rural India, things like that. But under capitalism, the peasantry has been exploited more than it ever was under feudalism by the new capitalist lords, which are the bourgeois. Between the bourgeois and the proletariat, there are many classes, such as the petty bourgeois. These are people who own some means of production, but do not have it yet at a scale to exploit a lot of proletarian. And they mostly work for themselves. You can think of your local family taqueria or the small Chinese restaurant whose only workers are family members themselves, right? You have these very small mom and pop shops. These are petit bourgeois. These are people who do own some means of production, but not large enough ones to exploit a lot of workers. And in fact, usually these people have to work within their own businesses themselves. Because the petit bourgeois is both exploited by the competition of the free market and bigger companies, right? Big monopolies are very often suppressing these small businesses, but also they have aspirations to become bourgeois themselves, right? They have aspirations to become these big businesses themselves. The petit bourgeois class consciousness is always confused. Sometimes they're revolutionary and on the side of the working class, or sometimes they're with the bourgeois. It always depends on the conditions of the society. For example, within Palestine, the Palestinian communists have said that their petit bourgeois are on the side of the proletariat because the petit bourgeois is also oppressed by the Israeli state apparatus. Within America, the petit bourgeois is mostly reactionary. Small business owners mostly support Donald Trump. I'm sure there are some small business owners that are revolutionary, but for the most part, they are reactionary within our societal context. So it really depends. Within China, too, the petit bourgeois were, the small business owners were revolutionary. Finally, between the bourgeois and the proletariat, there's one more class of people, and this is a bit of a controversial class as to whether it's really a class or not, but I'm just going to include it so that you know what it is. It's the lumpen proletariat. The lumpen proletariat are the most exploited people of the most exploited section of the working class that is left to die by capitalism. It is excluded from the system of capitalism itself, the legal aspects of capitalism themselves. These are homeless people, these are beggars, these are gangsters, these are criminals, these are prostitutes and sex workers. Marx and Engels themselves saw the lumpen proletariat as having no revolutionary potential, see them as a non-revolutionary section of the working class. However, future Marxists really challenged this, especially Fanon, who argued that they are revolutionary, that they can be used as a revolutionary class. It's a hotly debated topic that we don't really have time to delve into this podcast. Just know that the lumpen proletariat is a term used to describe all those non-legal aspects of capitalism, the people on the very edges of capitalism, homeless people, sex workers, things like that, criminals, gangsters. What is the state? The state is one of the most fundamental aspects of Marxist-Leninism. In Marxist-Leninism, the state is a tool of suppression in human society, right? So all aspects of our government that are used for suppression of one class by another are the state. So army men, policemen, courts, prisons, all of these are the state. And the bourgeois, which is the ruler of society, uses the state to suppress the working class. So the army, the police, the courts, the prison are all used to suppress the working class and to keep the bourgeois, the capitalist grip on power for themselves. The earliest human societies had no state. Our tribal ancestors didn't need police, they didn't need armies, they didn't need prisons. But when humanity first developed into class society with classes at the top, which represented a very tiny minority of the population, the ruling classes are always a very small section of the population, and classes at the bottom, which represented the vast majority of humanity, keeping these openly democratic forms of classes society without a state were unstable. And suddenly a state was needed to protect the rule of those people at the top, because the new rulers of society needed to suppress the masses in order to keep their hold on power. Therefore, the state was made as a tool. The state is always a tool of oppression of the ruling class over the ruled. And we call this a dictatorship of that class, right? So in Marxism, dictatorship is a very different word than what we usually colloquially understand dictatorship as. In Marxism, a dictatorship is just a class using the state to protect its interests, right? So a dictatorship of the bourgeois is the bourgeois class, the capitalist class, using its rule over the state, police, armies, jails, to protect its own interests against the working class, to suppress them. One example of this is you can really see how in a lot of protests, the American police often very brutally crack down on pro-Palestine protests, which stand against the American bourgeois and the military-industrial complex interests, crack down very heavily on the Amazon worker strikes. That's the dictatorship of the bourgeois using the state, the police, which is a tool of suppression in jails and courts, to crack down on any threats to its power. The state under capitalism, the dictatorship of the bourgeois, comes in many flavors, right? So there's liberal democracy, which isn't real democracy, but it is sort of the democracy that's taken place in Western style governments, America, Western Europe. There's constitutional monarchy, like England has. There's dictatorship and fascism. But at the end of the day, none of these things matter. As long as the tools of the state are used to suppress the working class from rising up against the bourgeois, it is a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. Class struggle remains one of the motivating engines of human development, as the struggle between the ruling classes and the ruled govern the actions of the state. Their conflicting interests begin to clash. For example, under capitalism, the bourgeois, because of the relations of society, are incentivized not to continue technological development, right? So everybody's best interest right now, because of the smog in the air, because of the cars, is to move towards green energy. But the capitalists, because their interests are short-term profits, are to have America rely on fossil fuels like gas, coal, things like that, and pollute our airs and kill workers because of polluted air. This is a class conflict that is moving history forward, this conflict between green energy and fossil fuels. Artificial scarcity and immense abundance, like having 16 million empty homes and only about 600,000 homeless people, cutting of wages, lengthening of work hours. This class conflict between us and the state, us and the dictatorship of the proletariat, is what moves history forward. And how it's resolved also moves history forward. No matter how much the state is used to suppress rising contradiction between the ruled and the rulers, the contradiction between their different interests eventually breaks into what is called social revolution, in which a new rising mode of production that solves the contradictions of the previous one are born out of the rotting, decrepit system of the old. All revolutions ultimately solve a contradiction within an old system with a new one, and this cannot happen peacefully. No ruling class in history has ever peacefully given up its power. The struggle of the proletariat is generally fought on 4 fronts, right? So it's very important to study what 4 fronts the working class struggle takes place. The first front is the economic struggle. This is where the working class fights for their best economic interests and rights under capitalism. These are the most basic and beginning forms of class consciousness within a working class, where workers fight for things like higher wages, their own economic interests, these like trade unions, striking for better wages or better contracts. However, because the economic struggle is often fought for reforms within the capitalist system, such as higher wages and better working contracts, there are limitations to the economic struggle, as it still keeps the systems of capitalism in place. And because they're usually focused on short-term protection of workers' rights, they don't change the system, the political system fundamentally. So whatever gains are made during these economic struggles can always be taken away, and usually are whenever the capitalists get the chance. The second phase of the working class struggle is going to ideological from economic. This is where the needs of a single worker gain class consciousness within the proletariat, in which the working class realizes that they shouldn't just fight for their own rights at their own company, like a Starbucks or a dock worker, but within their job, not within their job, but the entire capitalist system and the entire capitalist class itself. This is where the working class allies itself, not based on like, oh, I'm a Starbucks worker, I'm a dock worker, but I am a working class person. I'm going to unite with rail workers. I'm going to unite with trade unions. I'm going to unite with construction workers. The ideological struggle is when the workers of other industries and even other countries become united in a common struggle against the bourgeois. The trade union movements, while nice in terms of gaining rights, do not typically lead to the fostering of any class consciousness and therefore never evolve into socialism. Trade unions are great for starting that economic struggle, but oftentimes trade unions only end up transforming society into social democracies and end up becoming incorporated into the state. You can think of the AFL-CIO or all the trade unions like the UAW, which have become part of the democratic state apparatus. So that is why we need to transform our economic struggle always into an ideological struggle. Fostering class consciousness is an important task of Marxist-Leninist parties, as is resisting bourgeois ideas from infiltrating socialist and communist movements of countries, because bourgeois ideas always seek to infiltrate our communist movements and disguise themselves as bourgeois, as socialists themselves. After ideological struggle, where the working class realizes that it should be fighting as the working class and not just as a Starbucks worker or a construction worker, the third form of struggle is political struggle, in which the proletarian masses become involved with a working class vanguard Marxist-Leninist party, which guides them to begin organizing politically with the aim of bringing class struggle to the political sphere across a nation. And finally, the highest form of political struggle for the proletariat is revolution, as the big contradiction between the amazing gains of productive forces of the Industrial Revolution that they have brought upon humanity and the relations of how they are owned by a tiny minority leads to the working class seizing state power is for itself in a violent revolution and instituting in from a dictatorship of the bourgeois to a dictatorship of the proletariat, where the state is used for the first time for the masses. The tools of suppression are used for the benefit not of a tiny ruling class, but for the majority of humanity. This leads to a true equality, democracy, and democratic ownership of the means of production for the vast majority of humanity. Even though it's called a dictatorship of the proletariat, remember, this is not dictatorship in the way that we understand it. It's really much more democratic than our democracies were. You can really search up this in how Cuban democracy has mass participation. The Cuban people literally got to write their constitution. Meanwhile, in America, our Constitution was written by a couple elites in a hidden house on the East Coast, and there was no mass participation or input in it whatsoever. Under socialism, the workers come to power and smash the old state apparatus, creating a new one to continue to suppress reaction and bourgeois forces. Just because we have a revolution doesn't mean that the bourgeoisie disappears, doesn't mean that their interest disappears. There will always be people who want to return to the old way, always be people who want to return to the old means of production, always be people who want to return to capitalism and get their power back. And until that battle between the proletariat and the bourgeois is won, and the state cannot wither away. Once the class contradictions are completely gotten rid of, however, once there is no longer any capitalist states threatening to invade a dictatorship of the proletariat, then the state can wither away and humanity can enter into a stateless, classless society that we call full communism. So the dictatorship of the proletariat really can be seen as like the socialist phase, and then full communism is that stateless, classless, moneyless society where the state withers away, where the forces of repression wither away, right? So there can be still some institutions of what we understand as governmental bodies, democratic institutions of governmental bodies, but there's no more police or armies bashing in people's skulls. Proletarian revolutions happen within, quote, bourgeois democratic revolution, from a national liberation movement of oppressed people, from an anti-fascist, anti-imperialist struggle of liberation, end quote. Marxist-Leninism recognizes the masses as the main drivers of history, as they, and not the rulers, are the ones producing the material things for every single human economy. Ultimately, we're the ones that make the economy move. The bourgeoisie cannot live with us, but we can live without them. The masses are the sole role makers during the periods of revolutions, during wars of liberation, during defense, such as the brave Soviet masses in the resistance to the onslaught of fascism during World War II, the brave Algerian masses in their struggle against French imperialism. This is why adventurous actions, like individual acts of terrorism, without an organic connection to the masses, so often fail to spur revolution. A single individual going out and assassinating a representative of capitalism does nothing. It's only the masses that make history, a broad mass movement. Simply assassinating a high-level figure like Tsar Alexander, which is what happened in Russia, which does not involve the momentum of the masses, changes nothing about a system, and often isolates you from the masses you're trying to help out. The Narodniks, which hoped to spur on revolution by assassinating high-profile Russian figures, often ended up isolating themselves from the peasantry and the masses of Russian society because they thought they were these weirdos, and because the Narodniks did not work to connect themselves to them. Likewise, while leaders are important to guide the masses, ultimately leaders serve their specific historical condition and circumstances, and do not get anything done without the masses themselves, which is why the great man of history theory is so unrealistic. For example, the idea that Stalin and Mao controlled and did everything in their experiment and not the hundreds of millions of people in Russian and Chinese society, and because the material conditions of history assisting one person doesn't fundamentally change the events of history. If you went back in time and killed Napoleon, Hitler, George Washington, or even recently Brian Thompson, another Hitler, another Napoleon, another George Washington, and another Brian Thompson would eventually come about. And another Brian Thompson has come about as he has been replaced as the CEO of United Healthcare. That is because history is guided by the conditions of their time, not by leaders, not by a single individual. In addition, compared to weaker uprisings of slave and feudal society in which revolts were tiny, quote, the working class has raised the struggle against the exploiters to its highest level. It is the most organized of all oppressed classes in history. The working class is the only class that enters the struggle fully armed with scientific world outlook. It is not only a national but international force, welded together by strong links of proletariat solidarity. All this makes the workers' class struggle particularly powerful and enables it even in non-revolutionary, peaceful periods to play an immense part in political life, end quote. Capitalism, like all systems, was born out of contradiction. While it gave humanity many great progressive gains from earlier feudalism, it also involved, for the first time from the age of feudalism, a mass deprivation of people from the means of production. as the common lands that the peasants farmed on and were owned communally by peasants were closed off, and peasants were thrown off their land. Peasants became landless wanderers, and this was done purposely so peasants can work as proletariat, as workers in these mass machines, in these machines of production. So likewise, a section of the working class that is always too desperate and always unemployed has been created under our current conditions. And this sort of landless labor in our modern days is called the reserve army of labor. Under capitalism, there's been created an unemployed class, a class that's always so desperate to work for any kind of wage in order to be a strike breaker, right? So if you're trying to strike for higher wages, and there's always a homeless guy or a guy, willing to pay at any price, even half your price, that really ends up breaking your negotiating power with your boss. And so that's why a reserve army of labor has been created, a large, vast reserve army of labor, even though we have the means to employ everybody and give everybody a good paying job. We have to recognize that imperialism has led to a very uneven development within human societies. As, quote, the development of some countries takes place at the cost of suffering and disaster for the people of other countries. For the soaring development of the economy and culture of the so-called civilized world, a handful of capitalist powers of Europe and North Africa, the majority of the world's population, the peoples of Asia, Africa, Latin America, and Australia paid a terrible price. The colonization of these continents was made possible by the rapid development of capitalism in the West. But to the enslaved people, it brought ruin, poverty, and monstrous political oppression. In the process of colonialization, the quote-unquote cultured European people not only destroyed many civilizations from other continents, such as the Inca, Maya, and Aztec civilizations in America, which, for example, and in addition to the civilizations in Africa and Asiatic countries, it also exterminated whole peoples. Not one man of the Aboriginal population of Tasmania survived the colonization of that country. For example, the Aboriginal people of Australia were reduced from 300,000 to 47,000. During the assimilation, quote-unquote, of the territories in America, nearly 30 million Indians were destroyed, and the quote-unquote assimilation of Africa led to extermination and forced transportation abroad as slaves of nearly 100 million peoples. Likewise, one of the greatest rots within the imperialist age of capitalism is the great and progressive gains in technology made are used for the senseless slaughter of workers all across the world in wars and world wars, as the relations of capitalism demand that technology not be used for the good of humanity, but for its destruction. For example, all of the resources that were used within both world wars could have been used instead to house everybody. All of the materials used within the world wars were used instead of housing everybody. All of this lumber, steel, things like that, energy were used instead of giving everybody a house, which you very easily could have, were used to kill 80 million people within World War II. Socialism solves the main contradictions of capitalism, in which the means of production are used only for the benefit of a tiny minority of humanity, and the imperialist domination of other countries. As Lenin would say, quote, wherever you look, you come at every step across problems which humanity is quite capable of solving immediately. Capitalism prevents this. It has amassed enormous wealth and has made men the slaves of his wealth. It has solved the most complicated technical problems and has prevented the application of technical improvements because of the poverty and ignorance of millions of the population, because of the stupid of the handful of millionaires. Under capitalism, civilization, freedom, and the wealth call to the mind the rich glutton who is rotting alive through overeating, but will not let you live on. But the young is growing and will emerge supreme in spite of it all. End quote. One thing to mention, however, is that socialism historically has been built in the most underdeveloped and weakest links within the global system of capitalism, giving these social experiments a task of building up their societies in ways that they were not predicted to have had to do. As the absence of socialist revolution winning within strongly capitalist developed countries such as Britain, Germany, Western Europe, America, and instead within the most underdeveloped countries, Russia, China, Vietnam, these mostly peasant economies that were mostly feudal and had not had a strong capitalist relation before, has led to a contradiction and has led them to solve this contradiction in various ways. How did Marx, Lenin analyze capitalism? Marx and Lenin both lived in different eras of capitalism. Marx lived before capitalism reached its imperialist stage, and Lenin, after Marx died, was able to see capitalism in a way that Marx had not been able to see. We're going to examine both of the great contributions to Marxist-Leninism and analysis that Marx and Lenin made. First of all, we're going to start with Marx by summarizing the first volume of Das Kapital the best we can. I'm not an economist, and I hate economics. My least favorite part of Marxism is the economic side of Marxism. I'm much more of a engrossed within the political side of Marxism. But you have to understand the economic sides of Marxism before you understand the political sides of Marxism. So I'll do it the best I can. Marx, commodity production was the basis of capitalism. In fact, he began Das Kapital with a thorough explanation of commodities. What is a commodity? A commodity is most fundamentally something that is made to satisfy a need and made for exchange. For example, if you make a toothbrush, it is made for cleaning teeth. And if you make it for someone else, not yourself, that is a commodity, right? In addition, every single commodity has two values. A commodity has a use value and an exchange value. A use value is just the intended use of the commodity. For example, a toothbrush is to clean your teeth. A house is to live in. An exchange value is how much profit can be made from a commodity. How much profit can I make off of this home? The working class ultimately only cares about use values of commodities. We only care about the toothbrush to brush our teeth. We only care about the toothbrush or a home to live in, for shelter, for ourselves. The bourgeois, the capitalist, only cares about exchange value. That is why you have to buy a toothbrush at exorbitant prices. That is why we have 16 million empty homes, despite only having 600,000 homeless people. Homes are used for exchange value as commodities under capitalism, not for use value. One of the biggest questions that economists have had for centuries is, where does the value for a commodity come from? And Marx would answer this simply: labor. The amount of work people do over a society and how long it took them to produce a said commodity is what gives it value. Marx put the worker and the labor that they did at the center of the driving force of economies, and therefore this is called labor theory value. Money itself is a commodity that makes the exchange of other commodities easier, as instead of having to barter for 10 chickens for a cow, or a house, or a phone, money is able to be used as a universal measurement of value. Quote, the fundamental function of money is to serve as a measure of value for all other commodities. Money has also allowed the ruling elites of society to hoard value produced by a given society easier. It's a lot easier to have $10 million than, 500 cows, as it's easier to keep a lot of money in the bank. And even now, we have digital money, so, it's made it a lot easier to hoard well than past societies were able to. Because the value of a commodity is determined by socially necessary labor time, that's the amount of time across an entire industry that a commodity that people want to use is used to make it. So if you're able to produce 5 watches every single hour, everybody across your industry, and everybody wants that watch, that's the labor value theory, and that's going to factor into its cost. In the anarchy of the free market, where you have hundreds of businesses usually operating at the same time, the businesses that get the newest technologies manage to cut down on the necessary time to produce these commodities. And the faster that you can produce a commodity with labor, the lower you can sell them for, right? So if you're able to produce a watch, if you're able to produce 10 watches in an hour while your competitor is only able to produce 4, you're able to sell those watches at a lot lower of a price. when their rivals fail to take over their competitors, when that 4 watches an hour maker is unable to compete with you, you take over their business, right? You buy their business. And therefore, capitalism, no matter how many reforms, no matter what libertarians tell you, always tends towards monopolization because of competition, because of the anarchy of the market. Marx's other great realization was that ultimately all of capitalism is a pyramid scheme. As he dubbed it, surplus value. Because if you work for example, if you work in a watchmaking factory and you with your own 2 hands use your labor power to make $3,000 of worth of watches in a day and only get paid $200, $2,700 has been robbed from you. And that surplus value has been gone towards your capitalist boss. And this is a common theme for all workers across all industries. We all produce more value than we are paid. Where does this surplus value go then? It goes into the capitalist, who uses that surplus value amassed from millions of workers to reinvest their money to make more commodities, which then give them more surplus value that lets them reinvest their money again. This is called capital. When a capitalist gets money, like Jeff Bezos gets money from 100,000 Amazon warehouse workers, he uses that money to reinvest to exploit more workers. So next year, he's able to exploit 200,000 workers. And then these workers give him more money that allows him to exploit more workers, 500,000 workers, and on and on and on. This is how surplus value is turned into capital. Think of the old adage, boss makes $1, I make a dime, that's why I poop on company time. That's the simplest way to understand surplus value. In this way, our wages are actually illusions, as they completely hide the real value of extraction that is done to us by our bosses. Our bosses aren't going to show us that we actually made $3,000 worth of value in a day when we're only getting paid like $300 worth of wages. Think of Jeff Bezos. Those billions of dollars that he has, he didn't work for at all. That is surplus value that was made for by millions of workers employed by Amazon that he skimmed off the top of and gave each of those workers shitty wages that were nothing compared to what they produced. Jeff Bezos then used that surplus value to reinvest into exploiting more workers, expanding his industry. And billionaires now have more surplus value than that which would make even the pharaohs of Egypt blush. That is why we also work insane hours these days compared to our productivity, and our working hours no longer match our productivity. The more hours capitalists can keep us working, the more surplus value we produce for them. Essentially, within every single workday, there's a couple hours in everybody's workday that we work unpaid, making solely money for our bosses, surplus value for our bosses, without us even realizing it. It's money that we simply make for our boss to have a nice yacht. Capitalism ultimately, therefore, is incentivized to keep us working as long as possible to extract as much surplus value out of us as possible. Capital itself is surplus value that the bourgeois use to reinvest, as I said before. And this leads to an infinite growth within the system of capitalism, as they always need to reinvest their capital to exploit more workers, to reinvest their capital again, reinvest their capital again, reinvest their capital again. And because of competition, this has led to infinite growth within a finite planet, which is a natural tendency of the system. This infinite growth often overscales the purchasing power available in societies, especially since at the same time capitalists are incentivized to produce as much as possible. They're always incentivized to cut workers' wages, who are the main consumers of commodities. Who else is buying these commodities but us, the working class themselves? So when they're extracting as much as possible, producing as much as possible, and yet cutting our wages as much as possible from us, this leads inevitably to depressions, recessions, economic crashes, because it eventually leads to producing more than people can actually buy. Marx recognized that the source of all economic crashes is, quote, the poverty and limited purchasing power of the masses, and, quote, it is found that the mass of commodities thrown upon the market cannot be paid for by the masses of purchasers, in view of their limited incomes and purchasing power. Capitalism produces more and cuts wages more than people can buy. Under capitalism, increases in technological progress like AI is actually a bad thing, as these technological increases like new industrial machines that replace people in labor contribute to the reserve army of labor. It leads to people being unemployed rather than being used in the hands of the workers to make our lives easier. The reserve army of labor, as I described before, is that perpetually unemployed section of the working class that is used as bargaining chips to keep current workers from striking. Lenin's contributions would be taking the base given to him by Marx and expanding his analysis of capitalism to the age of imperialism, which Lenin dubbed the highest stage of capitalism, seeing it as capitalism's final and most highly developed form. Lenin had the great realization that capitalism in the 19th and 20th century had entered a new phase, the imperialist phase. Capitalism was a battle to conquer the market, a battle that inevitably led to the earlier free competitive era of capitalism to become dominated by finance monopolies, big banks and monopolies that merge together. Once these finance monopoly companies win the battle for the markets at home, in their home country, they begin to look abroad and expand their battle for capitalism abroad through imperialism. This battle of conquest and the export of capital lead them to dominate the entire world and bring whole territories and sections of the world under their control. You can think of, for example, Britain. Britain, during the Industrial Revolution, had a very highly competitive market. This market became concentrated into the hands of monopolies because capitalism inevitably leads towards monopolies, as Marx recognized. These monopolies became combined with banking capital, so it became finance monopoly capital. And once they won the battle for capitalism at home, they started expanding abroad through colonialism, through imperialism, and suddenly a whole section of the earth was under the British flag, under the British Empire. It had divided the world into a section for itself. The battle for the market was won at home, and then it began fighting for the battle for the market abroad. Therefore, these finance monopolies not only win the competition for the market at home, but across the whole globe. But once there is nowhere left to expand in dividing and conquering up the world, the imperialist powers turn on each other to redivide the world. Once Germany and Europe carved up all of Africa and Asia and Latin America, they had nowhere else left to expand and the Middle East. They had nowhere else left to expand but themselves. They had to fight each other to redivide up markets. And this fight for the redivision of markets we call world wars. Therefore, Lenin recognized that the division of world markets amongst imperialist powers, then fighting over each other to redivide the world in bombastic world wars, is an inevitable cycle of capitalism in its imperialist stage. And since Lenin's death, we have seen World War II, and we are currently on the precipice of World War III. God, I hope it does not happen, but it might. One of the most important aspects of imperialism is the export of capital. As you remember, capital is surplus value used by the capitalists to help them grow their businesses and exploit more surplus value from other workers. Under imperialism, this took on a whole new stage of international investment, in which imperialist capitalists from countries that have gained an insane amount of surplus value and development with nowhere left to invest within their own home economy began to invest their capital into poorer nations with cheaper labor power, resources, goods, land, etc., which leads to an unequal exchange and global inequality of the most disgusting type. For example, in 1960, 48% of all profits in America were from capital invested in the Middle East and Latin America, with American finance monopoly getting 5 times back the profit from what they invested into these countries. As you can imagine, America sucked these countries dry of all of their wealth. Imperialism also leads to the territorial division of the world. By 1914, 2/3 of the world was a colony or semi-colony of the great European powers. But with nowhere left to expand, all the markets conquered, the European powers had nowhere else to conquest but themselves. And thus began the age of world wars with the Great War, World War I, as they fought for access to each other's markets. For the colonies, quote, the yoke of the monopolies makes an all-round economic development of these countries impossible, end quote. But as much as finance monopoly capitalism and imperialism brings capitalism to its highest stages ever, it also begins the death knell for capitalism, as the monopoly stage of capitalism sets an inevitable rot within the system of capitalism. That's because unlike earlier stages of capitalism, monopolies under capitalism tend to stagnate technological development, progress, efficiency, with their tight grips on the market making such things impossible. Remember that previous example I used of how everybody wants to move on to green energy, which is a lot more efficient, and yet we have to rely on fossil fuels because gas monopolies want to keep us on fossil fuels in order to remain productive. These monopolies are literally slowing down possible human growth. And so the system of capitalism literally is eating itself. It's literally retarding our abilities to grow, to break out, to scientifically develop further. In addition, this new monopoly stage of capitalism in its disgusting exploitation slowly but surely begins getting rid of the few small democratic rights that were allowed under the previous stages, which always ends up evolving from liberal democracy into fascism. All capitalist countries, because finance and monopoly capital needs to hold on to its power and is very exploitative, leads to large amounts of unemployment, misery, with millions of workers being exploited, thrown out of jobs. And in order to hold on to their power, they need to evolve into fascism, get rid of democratic rights, take over the state. In addition, the age of imperialism has led within imperialist countries the creation of a new subclass, the labor aristocracy. This is a section of the global working class that through colonial loot has been bribed with better conditions to protect capitalism and imperialism against other workers. The labor aristocracy is the temporarily biggest block in stopping proletariat organization. However, it's a temporary bandage on a decaying system, and the labor aristocracy cannot forever impede the coming decay of capitalism. So you can think of how, under global capitalism today, the American worker, because of imperialism, lives 100 times better life than the African worker who American companies exploit. We literally have slaves that fund our lifestyle. And so a lot of us have become a labor aristocracy and get a much better lifestyle and therefore are incentivized not to do revolution. However, this cannot always remain. Slowly but surely, the labor aristocracy itself is facing the effects of capitalism as austerity and neoliberalism sets in during our current stage of capitalism. The imperialist stage of capitalism also leads to uneven development within a country itself. Think of the American South and the American North. The American South is so underdeveloped, and there's some places in there that have open sewage, almost like a third world country. In addition to globally, there's a disgusting unequal undevelopment. As, quote, under capitalism, it is impossible for individual enterprises, industries, and countries to develop evenly. Private ownership of the means of production, anarchy of production, and competition make the uneven development of capitalist economies inevitable. Some capitalist enterprises, industries, and countries lag behind, while others shoot ahead, end quote. In addition, Leninism has recognized, unlike Marx and Engels' old analysis, that socialist revolutions would happen not in the most developed places in the capitalist world, such as Britain, France, America, but with the recognition of imperialism and its contradictions, revolution will most likely occur in the least developed places in the world, as the systems of imperialism have allowed for socialist revolution to happen in the peripheries. This is called the weakest link theorem, the weakest link theory. After World War II, we saw not only monopolies within the imperialist states, but state monopoly, in which the state would become a big source for excess checks and balances on monopolies. So state monopoly is where monopoly finance capital and the state itself become married. This would lead to monopolies giving favorable loans to states, taking on costs for monopolies for new projects, bailing out companies whenever they failed. You can think of Obama bailing out the big banks in 2008 when they failed. Ultimately, the state and monopolies in our current stage of capitalism have fused into an unholy alliance that guarantees the best interest of the monopoly finance monopoly capitalism, with the state always being a safety net, not for us, but for the finance monopoly capitalists. You can think of how we are currently sending hundreds of billions of dollars to Israel and Ukraine, but none for the homeless people. The state does not serve us. It serves the interests of finance monopoly capitalism. And finance monopoly capitalism really right now badly needs to keep its military-industrial complex going. Why is that? State monopoly capitalism leads inevitably to militarization as monopoly companies, in an attempt to overcome the market, begin vying for government contracts. And the military is a great place for capitalists to put their surplus capital into. Militarization temporarily overcomes the limitations of the market and leads to a temporary boost in purchasing power and above capitalist stagnation. However, because of a wartime economy and this militarization requires such heavy taxes on the working class, which is the main producer of commodities, whatever gains are made by it eventually diminish as the working class's purchasing power goes away and the rot of the system comes back. So eventually, state monopoly leads to a hyper-focus on militarization because it's a great place for that finance monopoly capital to put its surplus capital within the military sector, which is why, we have to support Israel. Israel buys hundreds of millions of dollars worth of our weapons. You can think of it as the military-industrial complex. That's what it's colloquially known as in America. But this leads to the military eating up all aspects of society. Taxes that could go towards education, towards homelessness, etc., are all being fed into this big beast of the military, which is a great place for the capitalists to put their surplus value, their capital. In addition, militarization begins to take away valuable resources from other sectors of society. Quote, no matter how rich an imperialist country may be, militarization can only lead to a gradual exhaustion of the national economy, end quote. Think of how in America we currently are spending billions of dollars on the Pentagon and to kill brown people, but we have crumbling roads. Our infrastructure is rated at a class D by the Corps of Engineers. Quote, militarization of the economy leads to the expenditure of capitalist governments for social and cultural needs, schools, higher education, institutions, hospitals being reduced to a minimum. So militarization, as an inevitable result of state monopoly finance capital, always becomes a leech on society that slowly starts to decay it. And we're sort of seeing the military hollow out American society right now. Why did Marx and Engels see the working class as the inevitable revolutionary class? Part of it was that, quote, as a matter of fact, the working class is the only class that has no part in the ownership of the means of production and therefore does not attach any value to it. Moreover, since private ownership of the means of production forms the basis for the exploitation of the worker by the capitalist, its abolition and replacement by social ownership, i.e. by socialism, is the only way to liberate the working class. Lastly, in concluding that it was the working class that was destined to destroy capitalism and build socialism, Marx and Engels also based themselves on the fact that it was the only class possessing the fighting qualities needed to accomplish so great an historical objective. End quote. In addition, the working class, unlike other classes like peasants, are much more involved in politics, as capitalism has had to allow some political representation that peasants never really were able to have, nor were slaves. So as a result, the working class has a bigger political consciousness, they're educated, and they're able to make the profits of the capitalists, which allows parts of the intelligentsia to guide the rest of the working class. Finally, the working class has been one of the fastest growing classes in all of history. Almost every single human being, save face slaves, which still do exist under capitalism, and peasants, which still do exist under capitalism to some extent, are now workers. Almost the vast majority of humanity are workers. And every year, capitalism penetrates and grows bigger and bigger, creating more and more workers than ever. In addition, these workers are all united in being from the same class with the same enemy, which, combined with the ability to become politically organized and form working class parties, has allowed sections of the proletariat to shed national, racial, and mystical divisions and become class conscious, seeing their fellow workers across the globe as their brothers and sisters under the scientific ideology of Marxist-Leninism. The internationalism of the working class in the imperialist stage of capitalism also means the correct line for workers' movements is to support national liberation struggles. This is something that is absolutely hated by Trotskyists and other left comms that want a purely proletarian workers' resistance in our current stage of capitalism. However, quote, the grim lessons of history show that the colonial wars, for example, even if waged by imperialists in the remotest parts of the world, inevitably bring the working people increased economic difficulties and political reaction, and most important of all, increase the threat of new world carnage. Similarly, the defeat of the working class of any country at the hands of the imperialist bourgeois may, as a lesson from the fascism in Germany has shown, worsen the conditions for the working class movement in other capitalist countries and make it easier for the imperialists to unleash a world war, end quote. The working class has one of history's greatest burdens put on it, and that's not only to defeat capitalism, but to build a new equitable world after capitalism's ultimate defeat. In doing so, it will have to be one of the most creative classes in history, in that it ultimately seeks to destroy all classes and class relations themselves. The Russian Revolution was a historic moment in which, for the first time in human history, the working class put an end to capitalism, and it was all done against the common knowledge of traditional Marxism itself, which thought that socialist revolution would not happen in the least developed areas of Europe, but the most. However, towards the end of his life, even Marx had begun to recognize that, quote, revolution is beginning in the East, end quote. Russia was a society in the late 1800s and early 1900s that was caught between new technology and old relations, as it was slowly but surely adopting capitalist modes of production in Russia, but still held on to old feudal class relations. This overall led to some of the most disgusting exploitation and underdevelopment of any working class within Europe. It was out of this perilous situation that the contradiction of Leninism would be born. It was out of this situation and contradiction that Leninism was born, actually. Leninism is not a contradiction. Which would guide the working class of Russia and eventually many of the working classes of the world to victory. One of Leninism's great recognitions was that Russia was ready for socialism, that socialism could win in Russia and all underdeveloped countries without waiting for other European and more advanced countries to have their socialist revolutions. And this was against orthodox Marxism, which thought that socialists should allow the capitalists to win in Russia and underdeveloped countries first. In 1917, Russia was ready, as Lenin would say, quote, either perishing or entrusting her fate to the most revolutionary class for the swiftest and most radical transformation to a superior mode of production, end quote. The Russian Revolution proved that the workers didn't need capitalism, that socialist revolution could happen in the most underdeveloped countries, and that no country had to wait for a level of development under capitalism to do socialist revolution. As Lenin would say, quote, if a definite level of culture is required for the building of socialism, why cannot we begin by first achieving the prerequisites for that definite level of culture in a revolutionary way, and then with the aid of the workers and peasants, a government, and the Soviet system, proceed to overtake the other nations, end quote. The October Revolution would also be a Pandora's box that would show the colonized people of the world that they could overthrow their oppressors and show the workers of the world a model for how to live without capitalism. As Mao Zedong would say of the October Revolution, quote, the October Revolution helped the progressive elements in China and the rest of the world to apply the proletarian world outlook in determining the fate of the country and re-examine their problems. The conclusion was to follow the footsteps of the Russians, end quote. The October Revolution would inspire the May 4th movement in China, the anti-Japanese movements in Korea, the Indian liberation fighters, Indonesians, so on and so forth. President Sukarno of Indonesia, who was their progressive president, though he was a liberal, but he was very enticed by communism, would say, after the victory of the October Revolution in Russia, the struggle of the peoples of Asia for their national independence and against oppression of the usurpers flared up anew. This struggle became more organized and its aim clear and irreconcilable, namely immediate independence. The Russian Revolution was the first major blow to imperialist finance monopoly capitalism. The primary way the Russian Revolution was won was through Leninist conception of the Vanguard Party. What is the Vanguard Party? The idea of a working class party started with Marx and Engels, who would found the Communist League. However, Lenin would really build off of this to formulate how to run a communist party successfully and to get it to win revolutions. because Lenin would realize that certain sections of the working class are always more class conscious and advanced than others, and that the people should form parties, the class conscious people, the more class conscious people, should form parties and lead the rest of the working class through the vanguard proletarian party to revolution, especially in terms of elevating the class struggle from just a simply economic struggle for better wages and unions to a political struggle against the system of capitalism itself. Lenin recognized that the working class doesn't magically gain class consciousness on its own, and that is the role of the vanguard party, to lead the working class to revolution. And this is because so often working class movements that are not guided by a revolutionary vanguard party always end up towards some kind of reformism. Like I said before, the UAW, which was a very big union within America, a trade union, was not guided by Marxist theory or a vanguard party, ended up becoming part of the Democratic State Party apparatus and reforming itself away. This is the fate of all parties and political movements that do not use a vanguard party framework. The working class movements that always end up in trade unions, which fight for some rights, the working class movement that fights through trade unions always end up fighting for some rights, but always get incorporated into state machinery. Probably the best example of the need for a vanguard party is the Occupy Wall Street movement of 2008, which was the exact opposite of a vanguard party. It was a very anarchistic movement without any goals or any plans that was very spontaneous, but only for an economic struggle and not for a political one. What happened to the Occupy Wall Street movement? It fizzled out. The same thing with the mass protest movement in Chile, where the leaders ended up becoming liberal reformists within the government, and even to some extent, as great of an organization as it was, Black Lives Matter movement, which has become incorporated into the Democratic Party state apparatus. Ultimately, without the vanguard party, all these struggles end up fizzling out because of their anarchistic tendencies. A vanguard party leads an organized fight that generally begins with propaganda to win over the masses and getting a good political line, leading the masses in strikes and issues that they have, then moving that struggle politically to a socialist victory. Many communist parties are currently still stuck on the propaganda phase of getting the masses some sort of class consciousness. The vanguard party also has a centralized leadership and strong discipline and ideological lines that are not reformist. Without leaders, which is often something that people are against, but without leaders, we end up again with that 2008 Occupy Wall Street movement. But just because a party lacks strong leadership doesn't mean that it's not democratic, because Leninist vanguard parties run off of democratic centralism. What is democratic centralism? Democratic centralism leads all parties and communist countries in the world. Under democratic centralism, the majority of the party agrees on a line. The time for debates is over and everybody has to follow it. Because when making revolution, we cannot afford to have our party to be weak, fractured, or undisciplined. Once a topic has been debated and a general line has been discussed and agreed upon by the majority of the party, that is the line that everybody follows. If lines need to be changed, they can always be changed at the next party congress, which happen regularly. This allows the working class to have a platform, idea, and a plan. Anarchistic tendencies that reject any form of hierarchy whatsoever so often end up with their working class movements flailing into straight up failure. Quote, before a decision is adopted in various views may be expressed and opposite points of view may clash in a party, but once a decision has been adopted, all communists act as one person. This is the essence of party discipline, which requires subordination of the minority to the majority, end quote. In addition, quote, democracy without centralized leadership turns the party into a debating society. Centralism without democracy or inadequately developed democracy results in a deadening bureaucracy, end quote. And of course, the disciplined vanguard party actually has to finally listen to the masses and become popular with them. A revolution cannot be won if the vanguard party doesn't have the support of the masses. It is important for communist parties to listen to the masses. However, communist parties must not blindly follow everything that the masses believe in, because the masses often reflect reactionary ideas, such as anti-immigrant ideas, racist ideas. Communist parties have to be careful to filter revolutionary aspects of the masses and beliefs and filter out the reactionary ones. And the Communist Party's job is to lead the masses, not follow their reactionary, spontaneous ideas. Otherwise, we end up with a mess that is MAGA communism, which attempts to reflect all of the racist, white chauvinism of the American masses in their party line. Our goal isn't to do that. It's to reflect the revolutionary aspects of American society that we can find and to lead American society, not to follow its reactionary racist ideas like MAGA or nationalism. In addition, the need for a disciplined vanguard socialist party is because the bourgeois ideas always infiltrate leftist movements. During World War I, the Second International, which was the hub of most communist parties within Europe, betrayed the working classes and supported their governments and supported World War I. So a vanguard party really helps us avoid these revisionist bourgeois ideas from infiltrating our socialist movement. But as much as it is important to maintain a good ideological line, it's important also not to fall into dogmatism, in which communist movements get so high up in theory and ideology that they completely lose touch with reality, with the material world itself, and end up isolating themselves from the masses. Quote, the attempts to cling into yesterday to policies and organizational forms which no longer correspond to the changed conditions actually need, as Lenin put it, policies of revolutionary idleness, end quote. The workers' parties do not have an easy task. The bourgeois has, quote, at its disposal, powerful machinery for physical coercion, the police, courts, prisons, and ideological influence on the masses, church, school, press, radio, television, cinema. It also has on its side the force of habit, the force of tradition in an exploiting society, end quote. And in certain cases, this insurmountable task often requires a united front of all working class parties with the communists in order to stop reaction and fight fascism from winning. You can think of the KMT, which was the Capitalist Party of China, and the CPC, which was a Communist Party, who had to temporarily ally in a united front to fight Japanese imperialism. Or how the Palestinian communists today, both the PFLP, which is the Palestinian Front for Liberation of Palestine, the Communist Party, and the DFLP, which is their Maoist party, all work with Hamas and the Al-Qassam brigades to fight Israeli fascism and imperialism. Another broad alliance that communists often have to make is with the peasants. Even though an alliance between the working class and the peasant classes has been historically controversial, because orthodox Marxism believes that the peasants are not a revolutionary class, history has shown that peasants and workers are oppressed and threatened by capitalism the same, and therefore can make excellent alliances in order to take down the bourgeois. In America, this isn't really that important, but in societies like India or underdeveloped parts of Asia, where there are large peasant classes, and in Africa, it is important to remember this, that you can ally with the peasant classes. With communist parties and workers winning the peasants over by promising land redistribution and better rights for peasants, who are often crushed under capitalism with high rents and losing their lands. One thing that must be understood about communism within the imperialist stage of capitalism is that it is inevitably linked with the national anti-imperialist revolution of societies. The Great Russian Revolution itself can be seen as an anti-imperialist revolution, and that's because Tsarist Russia was a colonial empire that expanded into many Central Asian areas of Europe and deprived people there of their basic rights. The people of Central Asia and within the Russian Empire would be vital in the establishment of communism in the October Revolution. And the win of Central Asians, in addition to their rapid development under communism, gave colonized people all over the world a great model for liberating themselves. The Russian Empire really was called, towards the beginning of the Russian Revolution, sort of a British Empire, but except instead of overseas, it was overland. Russia really took over a lot of minority populations, and these minority populations were vital towards the Russian Revolution. And so the Russian Revolution really was a decolonial revolution in and of itself. Every single country under the yoke of imperialism sees mass discontent against it, because imperialism leads to underdevelopment. Nobody wants to be under imperialism, not the working class or even the native nationalist bourgeois of a country. Right, the bourgeoisie of a country doesn't want to be under imperialist either. There's always a section of the bourgeoisie that does, and there's always a section that doesn't. The only people under a country that ever support imperialism are the comprador bourgeois. This is a section of the bourgeoisie of a country that act as middlemen for European and American capitalism and imperialism. That's why now the national liberation struggle is always led by the working class people, and usually by a communist party in alliance with the peasantry and the national bourgeois. Why does the national bourgeoisie in a country suffering from imperialism even want to support revolution? Well, it's because the national bourgeois itself suffers from the dominance of foreign monopolies and is humiliated by the imperialists. It seeks not only to join the national movement, but to control it. That is why Palestinian communists ally with capitalist parties in Palestine like Hamas, or China allied with the KMT, which were capitalists to liberate their country from the Japanese. So often, Trotskyists and Bordigists claim that Leninists should not support national liberation, and that they should only support purely proletarian movement. However, Lenin was clear on this issue. Lenin himself said, quote, "Socialists must not only demand the unconditional and immediate liberation of the colonies without compensation, and this demand in its political expression signifies nothing else but the recognition of the right to self-determination. But they must render determined support to the more revolutionary elements in bourgeois democratic movements for national liberation in these countries and assist their uprising. And if such be the case, their revolutionary wars against the imperialist powers that oppress them." End quote. So Lenin said it's perfectly fine to support national liberation movements. That is the job of communists in our current era. There is no communism without the liberation of oppressed people of the world, even if that means their national liberation includes the national bourgeois and their aspirations. As history has shown us, quote, "Colonialism does great harm to the fundamental interests of the working class of both oppressed and oppressor nations." End quote. Members of the party are put into leading branches, and discussions on topics are allowed. But once the Marxist-Leninists understand nationalism for what it is, a progressive force in historical development in the right context, that is the global South. Nationalism in the imperial core countries like America, France, Britain, serves monopoly finance capitalism and imperialism, not weakens it, as the MAGA communists would have you believe. But nationalism in the global South, such as Vietnam, Burkina Faso, Palestine, is a liberatory nationalism that strikes at the heart of imperialism itself. As Lenin would say, quote, "The bourgeois nationalism of every oppressed nations in the global South has a general democratic content which is directed against oppression, and it is this content that we support unconditionally," end quote. Nationalism within the global South, therefore, plays a progressive role that even Lenin recognized. Quote, "The Western bourgeois is in a state of decay. It is already confronted by its gravedigger, the proletariat. In Asia, in contrast, there is still a bourgeois capable of championing sincere, militant, consistent democracy, a worthy comrade of France's great enlighteners and great leaders at the close of the 18th century," end quote. National liberation struggles, when successful, always either end up with two things. If the Communist Party was particularly strong in the national liberation movement, it ends up leading it as a socialistic nation. If the national bourgeois was stronger when leading it, it ends up as a nationalistic liberation that remains a capitalist state but protects their own national interests and still has a jump to a higher stage of economic development. It still allows for a jump to a higher economic stage of development, such as socialism and socialist revolution in the near future. Ultimately, the great thing about national liberation is that even if it ends up as capitalism, is that the people of the country are no longer doubly oppressed by both imperialism and their own native bourgeois. They're only now oppressed by capitalism of their native bourgeois, and which still isn't great, but it is a positive development that alleviates pressures off of people. Countries that free themselves from direct colonialism after World War II often had a very hard job. If they were not socialist and their national bourgeois won, then these countries either had two options. One was, since they had such little capability to develop, it was to become subservient to European and Western capital again. And because African and Asian and Latin American states did not possess the capital required to do imperialism themselves or invest their economies vigorously, this led them to essentially becoming colonized again, in everything but name. And that is our current stage of imperialism. It's called neocolonialism. In neocolonialism, the imperialists grab a section of the bourgeois from a country and use them to dominate the country, turning the country into an export-based country with very little development. Quote, in words, the inspirers of neocolonialism support industrialization, but by this, they mean only the development of light and mining industries and the means of transport and communication, something that cannot essentially endanger the economic positions of foreign monopolies, end quote. So essentially, whatever investment America is doing in Africa, it's to export as much capital out of it for itself. A modern-day example of this would be President William Ruto of Kenya, who is backed by America, exports tons of resources from Kenya against the will of the people and keeps them impoverished, allows American capital to penetrate the country as much as they want, and keeps profits for a small class for himself and the comforter bourgeois, while most Kenyans suffer. If you want to hear more about President Ruto, you can go back to and listen to our interview with the Communist Party of Kenya. Neocolonialism is very dangerous because is a very dangerous stage of imperialism because a country seems independent in every sense except economically. A country gets its own flag, it seemingly gets to pick its own president, but it remains a puppet and a cookie jar of imperialist powers, in terms of every economic sense. This can be seen through the modern day by IMF loans, which end up with many countries in debt entrapments. The other path of self-development is through heavy involvement of the state in the economy. This is not socialism by any means, but states like Gaddafi's Libya would use the state in order to develop their own national economy in a way that the free market couldn't allow, and allowed them to have independence from imperialist states. This is what national liberation does when it is not led by communists, and communists don't end up winning. The Sahel region of Africa, which has recently freed itself and has become the AES Confederation from French imperialism, seems to be doing just that. Though they might later on become full socialist, it's too early to tell where exactly the Sahel states are heading. Ultimately, then, under a current stage of imperialism, capitalism in non-socialist countries, quote, state capitalism plays a progressive role. The very spread of such forms is very significant and provides a new symptom of bankruptcy of capitalism. State capitalism here is like that Gaddafi state involvement in capitalism. However, this is not the end-all be-all of revolution, and state capitalists can become reactionary themselves. Since they are capitalists and they have rulers with interest in capitalism, they can be won over by American capital, they can suppress their own workers and their rights, they can crush their communist and workers' movements, and they can be goaded into infighting by imperialist powers. And so we should approach state capitalists that have freed themselves through national liberation with a critical eye and not follow them blindly. After World War II, American monopoly finance has become the biggest world hegemon of imperialism, with it quickly taking over European states. America really has taken over the sovereignty in alliance with the bourgeois and the bourgeois of Europe with America to stop the spread of socialism and to stop the spread of national liberation, has taken over European countries and their sovereignty. America managed after World War II to invest itself within every single country in Europe, and therefore within Europe, Europe's colonies, and help Europe and American enrichment take over the rest of the world through neocolonialism. American dominance over the world has also been done through the building of military bases within countries, within its hegemonic bloc all over the world, with the goal of keeping these countries from rebelling and protecting its monopoly finance capital and its interests, as it's a lot harder to liberate yourself from American imperialism when you've got an American military base within your country. As Otto writes within the Fundamentals of Marxist-Leninism, prophetically within 1960, quote, a system of satellites dependent in some degree or another on the leading imperialist power, the United States, is coming into being, end quote. And we are living in that era of satellite states that America has all over the world. State monopoly capitalism has reached a new stage where it cannot be confined to the borders of a single country now. And so it tends towards big international economies and agencies such as the EU, ECOWAS, which is in Africa, etc. These big international economic agencies all effectively do is lead to the domination of the strongest economies over the weakest ones. Quote, the imperialists advertise in every possible way that the supranational nature of these organizations, but in reality, the supranational nature is expressed in the fact that their member countries have lost their independence in determining important aspects of their economic policy. This stage of capitalism after World War II that we're currently in has seen them breaking down of all tariffs, borders, economies, and becoming integrated into one single world economy with a large monopoly finance interests without borders. However, as I'm recording this project, this free neoliberal order seems to be breaking down for a more ugly inter-imperialist interfighting once again. So we will see how capitalism ends up developing in the next coming decades. The nationalism of oppressed nations remains a progressive force in terms of fighting capitalism and pushing forward socialism. As Lenin would say, quote, "The fatherland, the given political, cultural, and social environment is the most powerful factor in the class struggle of the proletariat. The proletariat cannot be indifferent and too unconcerned about the political, social, and cultural conditions of its struggle, and consequently cannot remain indifferent to the fate of its country. But the destinies of country interest it only to the extent that they are affected by the class struggle, and not in the virtue of some bourgeois patriotism, quite indecent on the lips of social democrats," end quote, which is what MAGA communism falls into, that bourgeois patriotism. Liberal bourgeois democracy always remains a fake democracy, I should remind you. Capitalist democracy is not real democracy, under which state monopoly is beholden to the monopoly finance interests of big capitalists, in addition to whatever democratic gains are given to people under liberalism are always eventually eroded away. Liberalism always, again, tends towards fascism, as, quote, "the aggravation of the class struggle, the further weakening of the positions of capitalism, and the fear of socialism, whose forces are continually increasing, drive monopolies into extremes in both internal and external policy." Our world currently slips into world war. It is very important to remind you that our goal as communists is always to avoid imperialist wars as much as possible and to push for peace, especially in our nuclear age. Recently, as I'm recording this, America has said that it might strike the nuclear facilities of Iran, even. Quote, "The monopolist bourgeois, being a class without any future in history, may, in the face of all common sense, plunge into adventure of a new war, even at the risk of taking whole countries and peoples with it into this perdition. Peace cannot be begged for from the imperialists, but it can be forced from them," end quote. Bar none, the biggest contradiction under our current stage of capitalism is the schism between monopolies and all classes within society: peasants, intelligentsia, workers, even sometimes small capitalists. Oh, intelligentsia are like office workers. They're like a smarter section of the working class, like the white-collar workers, you could say. Academics, things like that. Doctors, academics, teachers, professors, which it exploits. Subordination to subordination, gets rid of democratic rights, etc., etc. And therefore, quote, "there's no remedy for this national calamity except by uniting all the workers and democratic movements, opposing the oppression of financial oligarchy into a single mighty stream, which will sweep away the dictatorship of the monopolies and remove all its agents," end quote. The way that Marx had traditionally envisioned revolution happening was that first, a bourgeois capitalist revolution would happen and would implement in a capitalist mode of production. Then a socialist revolution would follow. A socialist revolution, therefore, for most European Marxists, was impossible without a bourgeois capitalist revolution. You could not do socialism unless a country was capitalist first. And some countries like Russia were feudal. But Lenin's great contribution was a realization that in the new age of imperialism, capitalism had developed so highly and created such a strong working class that the working class could lead a country into a capitalist revolution, then a socialist one, as one seamless revolution, and didn't need to let the rich, the bourgeois, to take over, didn't need to wait for this long period of capitalist development between socialism and feudalism. And that's what happened in Russia in the revolution of 1905, which was a capitalist revolution. Then in 1917, they had a socialist revolution. And that's what happened in China, which very quickly had a capitalist revolution with their KMT. And then in 1949, 1949, the CPC one, the communist one. And so you don't have to have this long capitalist development period anymore. You can speed it up because of imperialism. Well, that's pretty much what Lenin was saying. And in doing so, the working class would take the state from a dictatorship of the bourgeois to a dictatorship of the proletariat, using its instruments to surpass the bourgeois classes in defense of the working class and transition society towards socialism and communism. In breaking with Marx and Engels' ideas of socialist revolutions, inevitable coming from the most highly developed capitalist countries, Lenin recognized that in the age of imperialism, revolution in fact happens in the weakest links. Quote, "It implies a country or group of countries in which the economic and political contradictions of capitalism become particularly acute, in which the ruling classes prove incapable of coping with revolutionary movements, and revolutionary forces being great and organized, in which, therefore, the most favorable conditions are present for the overthrow of capitalism, end quote. World wars, as much as they reveal the worst aspects of capitalism, also break the system, and so much that they inevitably lead to the great workers' revolutions, with the Russian Revolution quickly following the First World War, and the Chinese, Korean, and North Vietnamese revolutions all following the Second World War. Lenin's 3 criteria for a revolutionary situation are important to remember, because we need to know whether or not we're in one right now, or it's not really a revolutionary situation. A revolutionary situation occurs when 1, it is impossible for the ruling classes to maintain their rule in an unchanged form. When there is crisis in one form or another among the upper classes, a crisis of policy of the ruling classes which causes a fissure. So shit gets so bad that even the ruling classes cannot keep on their hold on to power. 2, when the want and suffering of the oppressed classes has become more acute than usual, when the working classes, when the bottom classes, the oppressed classes really begin to suffer. And 3, when, as a consequences of the above causes, there's a considerable increase in the activity of the masses, who in a tumultuous time are drawn both by all the circumstances of the crisis and by the upper class themselves into independent historical action. So it's a revolutionary crisis when the ruling classes can no longer rule as they were doing before as easily, and it's really hard to, when there's a lot of suffering by the ruled classes, and when the masses begin to organize and start to act. In this, Lenin recognized that the masses being angry at the rulers of a country simply wasn't enough. The rulers of a country had to get into a point of crisis where they couldn't even maintain their rule anymore. Leninist parties therefore don't only pay attention to the consciousness of the masses, but also the fuck-ups of the ruling classes, the bourgeois. However, the conditions for revolution could absolutely theoretically be perfect, but without a working class party there to guide the workers actually doing action, nothing is going to happen. They're just going to find something else to fix this issue, like fascism or some new way to do capitalism. When the dictatorship of the bourgeois is overthrown by the working class, the enemies of the working class still remain. So does capitalist relations, which is why a dictatorship of the proletariat is needed to both suppress the enemies of the working class and also transition society from capitalism to socialism. Now, dictatorship of the proletariat does not mean dictatorship in the way that we understand it. Again, I have to remind you, it simply means the tools of the state, the police, armies, prisons are used to suppress reactionaries. In fact, a dictatorship in this sense is more democratic than liberal democratic society. As when the first Soviets were established in Russia, up to 12 million people participated in them as delegates in congresses, etc., etc. There's mass democratic participation in the dictatorship of the proletariat because the masses are ruling society. That's because the bourgeois never give up their power peacefully and will try to restore their power whenever they can. And in the era of global capitalism, they can rely on help from America and the Western capitalist states in trying to reestablish power. Quote, the dictatorship of the proletariat is inevitable in any transition from capitalism to socialism. It is necessary for crushing the resistance of the exploiters and the suppressing the activities of criminal elements, which, like scum, rise to the surface during this period, end quote, as the workers take the tools of the state from the bourgeois. Ultimately, the dictatorship of the proletariat cannot survive without mass support or democratic participation from the masses. So do not think of it as the absence of democracy, but in fact the creation of a better democracy than what we get under liberalism and capitalism. As, quote, democracy in the imperialist countries is a screen for the very real dictatorship of the big capitalist monopolies, directed against the working class, against the working people, end quote. And it also always inevitably devolves into open fascism. Workers' democracy, rather than seeing the rule of the minority over the majority, sees the rule of the majority over the minority. The dictatorship of the proletariat works under democratic centralism, which means, quote, means of an administration of affairs relating to the whole state by one center and subordination of local bodies to the center, coupled with elections in all organs of power and their accountability to the people, and with the largest possible drawing of the popular masses into the work of administration and of granting of independence to all local bodies, end quote. So there was mass political participation in the Soviet Union. There is mass political participation in Cuba, in China, and democratic participation. There are elections, Do not fall for this bullshit where people say that, oh, Stalin or Kim Jong-un completely rules society. In addition, quote, all state bodies in the dictatorship of the proletariat rely on the popular masses, maintain constant contact with them, heed their opinion, and are under their control. Persons holding offices within these bodies are subject to election, are accountable to the people, and can be recalled. Most officials of the machinery set up by the proletarian dictatorship come from the working people, end quote. Trade unions do exist under the dictatorship of the proletariat, and they are incorporated into the state. And though they are not given state power, because giving them state power would lead to sort of an anarchy of production, which might restore capitalism, they are used as democratic organs, quote, against bureaucratic distortions of the Soviet apparatus, in the sense of protection of material and spiritual interests of the working masses by means inaccessible of other apparatuses, end quote. So trade unions are really used as a check on power in case the bureaucracy of the state gets too much. It's a mass democratic check on power, which people can participate in. The way that the dictatorship of the proletariat is implemented changes on the conditions of the country, and it might simply be a one-party state, like for example, in the Soviet Union, or a Marxist-Leninist party leading a united front in collaboration with other parties, which may implement in a dictatorship of the proletariat with like 3 or 4 parties. North Korea has 4 political parties, all united, led by the Korean Workers' Party, I believe is what it's called, or the WPK. In the United Front case, it's usually due to the working class not being as strong and needing other class alliances. Like in the WPK in North Korea, they ally with the Chodondist Party, which is a Christian peasant party. So North Korea's working class wasn't really that strong, so they needed to ally with like Christians and peasants, things like that. So that's why they have like a multi-party system. As long as all these parties are committed to the dictatorship of the proletariat and the ultimate goal of building socialism and communism, then it's all right, to have like a united front. As Lenin would say, quote, all nations will arrive at socialism. That is inevitable. But they will not arrive at it in exactly the same way. Each will introduce something specific in one form or another of democracy into one or other variation of the dictatorship of the proletariat, into one or another rate of socialist transformation of various aspects of social life. Now, the dictatorship of the proletariat is not a permanent phase. Remember, our ultimate goal is to have the state eventually wither away, is eventually to have a stateless, moneyless, classless society. Of course, we cannot do this when, for example, there's other capitalist states that are threatening to take over our society. Quote, the founders of Marxist-Leninism never regarded the dictatorship of the proletariat as the end in of itself. They saw it merely as a necessary means for suppressing the overthrown classes and ensuring the building of socialism. Lenin stressed the aim of the dictatorship of the proletariat is to build socialism. He spoke of the period of the dictatorship of the proletariat as the period of transition from capitalism to socialism. The dictatorship of the proletariat, where the working class yields the state to transition society to socialism, was always envisioned as eventually withering away as it was no longer needed. And this withering away would happen when the class antagonisms disappeared and the need for the state itself disappeared. When humanity was finally able to transition to that fully stateless, moneyless society we call communism. We'll call it full communism, and that's what a lot of Marxist-Leninists call it for simplicity, because I can't call socialism communism. It gets confusing. Well, if the dictatorship of the proletariat is supposed to be temporary, if the dictatorship of the proletariat is just supposed to be transitionary phase, why are so many countries still dictatorships of proletariat? Well, the reason that they are is because they're under siege. Socialist revolution hasn't won globally yet, and thusly getting rid of their states and developing to full communism, as some anarchists want them to do, would be pretty much inviting their own end under an imperialist war. I mean, good God, it'd be stupid as fuck. I mean, America would bomb the fuck out of China the second it got rid of its state. Socialism, wherever it is built, is always marked by a level of production issues between the old society and the new mode of production, because socialism has historically been built in very underdeveloped countries. And while capitalist propagandists love to compare like war-torn Russia to highly developed America that's lived in peacetime for hundreds of years, the USSR started out as at a lower level of productive forces and had to catch up. And this has been pretty much true of China, Vietnam, Korea, All these societies were war-torn. All these societies were very highly underdeveloped, and they had to catch up. Even when starting out with less, socialism was better than capitalism in taking care of its citizenry, especially as it began to catch up to the capitalist world as these experiments built up their productive forces. The biggest wins of the working class under the dictatorship of the proletariat is winning the wealth of society. In countries with less developed productive forces like Russia, this meant workers' rights they'd never had before. Like immediately when the Russian Revolution won, an 8-hour workday was implemented, which before they were working like 12, 14 hours. And slowly, the productive forces were built up. Eventually, Soviet citizens got childcare institutions, free housing, subsidized vacations, free education for their children. In highly developed societies with unlimited wealth, like America, they could not even provide their children that. And as Russia continued to develop its productive forces, these rights became greater for its average citizen. Because Russia had little to no productive forces, Russia built up all of her own productive forces from the ground under a socialist mode of production, something that had never been done before and was against all Marxist orthodoxy. Really, you're supposed to let the capitalists build up the productive forces, and then you're just supposed to change the relations of production. But it ended up being very successful in the end, and building up of her productive forces under the 2 5-year plans allowed Russia to defeat the Nazis, survive World War II, and go from an agrarian economy to a leading industrial behemoth and world superpower. China also followed her example. In countries with highly developed productive forces like America, socialist jobs wouldn't be to build up factories. It would just be simply to reorganize the relations of production and even to some extent degrowth our economy, because our economy is disgustingly overdeveloped to a point where it's wasteful. The results of socialist industrialization in USSR were great. Quote, by 1937, 98.7% of the production facilities were public property, that is belonging to the socialist state or collective farms and cooperatives. By that time, essentially everything had become publicly owned. What does a socialist economy look like? Well, in a socialist economy, these elements are combined in such a way that those taking part in the production process collectively own the means of labor which they employ. This totally excludes the possibility of the means of production being converted by one part of society into means of exploitation of the other part of society, end quote. The two ways that socialism has historically manifested itself is state property, with the state nationalizing industry and representing the workers in doing so, and cooperative. But having workers' co-ops is not a magical cheat code for building socialism on their own. That's because, unlike how many people will have you believe that workers' cooperatives under capitalism will magically help us create socialism, quote, historical experience shows that under capitalism, cooperation of small producers in most cases assumes a bourgeois character. In socialist society, when the working class and peasantry are in power and the state sector predominates in the country's economy, the cooperatives become socialist in character, end quote. So essentially having workers' co-ops under capitalism leads these workers' co-ops to act in a capitalist way. They can only be socialist under a socialist economy. Under socialism, the surplus value of society doesn't go towards a small group of CEOs, but instead back to the whole society itself. Does socialism have commodity production? This is a really great question. Marx identified commodity production and its relations as one of the foundations of capitalism. But yes, while many left communists often say that the USSR and all socialist experiments were failures and not real socialism because they continued to engage in both commodity production and the money relation, what they forget to account for is that when you go from an undergrown agrarian economy to build up your productive forces, you need commodity production. You need money relation, especially when you go from an underdeveloped economy that's never had a capitalist phase before. And the socialist commodity production was radically different from the capitalist commodity production as, quote, socialist commodity production is a commodity production without private ownership, without capitalists, without small commodity producers. It is carried on by state enterprises, agricultural co-ops, and artisans, and handicraftsmen cooperatives, i.e. associated socialist commodity producers. Exchange is not only form of social connection between them as it is under capitalism. Before any exchange takes place, the socialist commodity producers are linked into a single whole. through the collective property and joint participation in planning and guiding the national economy. That means that production cannot be turned into a means of exploitation, since they are collective property. The land, this important means of production, cannot be bought or sold. Hence, it is no longer a commodity, nor can labor power become a commodity in socialist economy. The working people who collectively own the means of production obviously cannot sell their labor power to themselves." End quote. In addition, the value of commodities is no longer determined by the free market or exchange value, but instead, quote, "on socially necessary expenditure of labor." Not the market, but production itself becomes the chief sphere of operation of the law of value. End quote. In addition, through strategic pricing, the state under socialism is able to stimulate growth in other sectors of the society. Socialist central planning allows sectors of society in socialist states to eliminate major issues under capitalism, like unemployment. Under capitalism, workers are pitted against each other in competition. However, the great thing about a socialist economy is that when a worker is good at something, he is encouraged to teach others how to be as good as him and how to be as productive as him. Work becomes less cutthroat and more cooperative. That's because you and your coworkers and the society around you own your workplace and not your boss. In a socialist economy, if someone produces more value, do they get paid the same? No. Wages are based on one's productivity. Those who make more value get more value. In addition, everyone gets free social services like healthcare, education, pensions, and subsidized housing, which also add to one's wage. And socialist democracy worked, especially in terms of mass participation. For example, quote, "although altogether about 340,000 workers and nearly 780,000 collective farmers were elected to local Soviets in 1959. Under socialism, the masses directly participated in their government in ways that doesn't even exist in America." I can never imagine in America 340,000 people or 780,000 people collectively working towards the means of production in their Soviet, in their government, in their representative bodies, making decisions. That's impossible. So this is what we're talking about when we're talking about the dictatorship of the proletariat being a true democracy. A cultural revolution also happens during socialism. A socialist revolution is not only a revolution of economy, it's also a revolution of culture. As Lenin would say, quote, "we must take the entire culture left by capitalism and build socialism out of it. We must take all the science, technology, all the knowledge and art. Without this, we cannot build a communist society." In essence, the creation of a new workers' culture out of a previously reactionary one. That is because rather than being owned by elites, a cultural revolution is able to happen because all of these things like clubs, libraries, places of culture, theaters, museums, cinema, radios, television, suddenly become owned by the workers rather than the bourgeois, rather than the capitalists. We get to own these things, and so we get to direct them and have a cultural revolution. Socialism and the dictatorship of the proletariat is not the final evolution of humanity, however, as the ultimate goal of every society is to eventually build up the base for the slow and gradual transition to a stateless, moneyless, classless society known as communism, or as we will call it, full communism. What is full communism? As the state and under socialism begins withering away, when old class antagonisms are completely eradicated, as socialist society gets closer and closer to that full communism, the workers of said society will stop being highly specialized in fields of divided labor. Division of labor will slowly break away. All men will become well-rounded individuals. No longer will people be stuck in a single occupation. Marx saw the division of labor itself as a suppression of a man's whole intellectual capabilities. In China, during their early period, something similar was tried. As in people's communes, people would be educated in a well-rounded way and do multiple jobs throughout a year. Somebody could be a soldier, they could work in the fields, they could be a factory worker, with the hope that no single individual could become monopolized into a single field. And also, this breakdown of the division of labor lent itself to more efficiency towards the Chinese economy, as farmers that used tractors on their communes would work in factories, so they knew how to repair their tractors because they knew their tractors inside out, because they were making the tractors in the factories than working in the fields. Well, Marx did not give us much as to what full communism would look at. Marx did not describe what full communism would look like fully. He always sort of kept it vague because he was in such an early phase of capitalism, he could not fully envision it. And as we get closer and closer to full communism, we'll be able to see what it looks like completely. We can't really see it now in the early phases of capitalism or even the early phases of socialism. He did give us some insights as to what he thought full communism would look like. As he saw it, as socialist society begins to transition to full communism, the state begins to wither away. The democratic parts of society become amplified, the democratic institutions of society. People will slowly stop working for money and start working for their own initiative. A new culture will be incorporated into people in which they will reasonably seek out commodities, not for money and not for work. This doesn't mean that people will start hoarding diamonds as everything becomes sort of inevitably free, but anything that people need as the productive forces of humanity reach a point of automation and production eliminates scarcity, within reasonable need will become available. So essentially, money will go away. People will get commodities as they need them, as long as it is reasonable. So if you need pants, you will get pants. If you need a donut, you will get a donut. But if you want 500 diamonds, you are not going to get those in full communism as money is gotten rid of. The barriers between intellectual and physical work will disappear as automation helps us with this, especially, and big industrial machines help us. And man will have free time to use his mental and physical and philosophical capabilities. The repressive parts of the state, such as police, prisons, will start to disappear, as will the state itself, and armies themselves, war itself. Money itself will disappear, finally. Full communism would also become a society of each according to his ability, each according to his need. It will become a true meritocracy. In addition, under full communism, quote, leisure time will greatly increase. Let us recall the great significance of Marx attached to this. He said that under communism, the wealth of society will be measured not by the amount of working time, but by the amount of free time of each of its members. Leisure means not only time for rest, but the restoration of man's strength, but also the use of words, as Marx said, the space for development of his personality. The members of the new society, cultured people of versatile development, will undoubtedly find rational and worthy ways of filling up space. Study will become just as much an integral element of each man's way of life as work, rest, and sleep. Enjoyment of all kinds of cultural benefits will rise immeasurably. Society will become richer, which will be able to assign us ever more resources and labor for the production of these benefits. Will we ever see full communism within our lifetimes? I doubt it. This is something that will take generations to build under a dictatorship of the proletariat. Finally, I'll end this with this quote. What a boundless field of activity will be opened before communist society in the development of the abilities and personality of all its members, in achieving physical and spiritual perfection of people themselves. The advance of the shining heights of communist civilization will always engender people an unusual power of will, intellect, creative impulses, courage, and life-giving energy. And that is the fundamentals of Marxist-Leninism by Otto and by the Soviet Union Institute of Social Studies. And ultimately, it really helps you describe Marxist-Leninism. Marxist-Leninism is one of the most amazing ideologies, the most scientific, the most successful. It has lifted millions of people out of poverty. It has dictated what capitalism will do time and time again. It has given us a tool to overthrow capitalism and build a better world, comrades. Study, learn, work. A better world is possible, and we will build it. This episode of the Pokepreet Pod has been brought to you by our generous members on our Patreon. If you'd like to become one of them, go to patreon.com/thepokepreetpod. Thank you. What the fuck? Glory to Stalin, I barely made it. And a special shout out to our Marshal of the Soviet Union member, Matthias T. If you'd also like a shout out, please consider subscribing to our Patreon, where you can also get episodes up to a month early. Thank you.